Our story begins in Seoul, the capital of South Korea. It was an ordinary sunny day outside. There was absolutely nothing to indicate impending disaster. Suddenly, there was a terrifying explosion. The city was destroyed in an instant and engulfed in merciless flames. In history, this day was marked as X Day. A nuclear bomb launched by another country hit the very heart of Korea. But now we will return 3 years before this tragedy. Our hero had already begun to actively prepare for a terrifying future. Now literally from every iron everywhere they are trumpeting that humanity is already on the brink of the apocalypse. But despite this, only 2 groups of people prepared for it. And one of them were the rich, the most powerful people in the world, because in their position, they have to worry about everything. The second group included people who truly believed in the coming end of the world so strongly that they were ready to risk everything. Our Thomas belonged precisely to this category. To begin with, he got rid of all his assets. After that, he began to greedily absorb all the information that could at least hypothetically help him survive. And the first thing our hero was concerned about was finding a place suitable for building a shelter. Thomas selected it quite carefully. After some thought, he identified 3 key requirements for a suitable location, after which he highlighted the possible options on the map. His first criterion was a sparsely populated area where hardly anyone would come even in the most extreme case, but not too far from the city. Secondly, the terrain had to give Thomas an advantage in case of attack. The very last criterion, perhaps the most important of all, is cost. The hero carefully explored all the places he had highlighted on the map. And finally, he found a worthy place. Next to it, there was a deserted forest belt near the Air Force Base on the outskirts of the capital area. Without wasting any time, Thomas immediately settled there. He was lucky enough to live next to an old man with whom they did household chores together. The hero did not remember the name of this old man, but he remembered his last name, Kim. He was the owner of the land near the Air Force Base. Soon, Thomas found workers who agreed to help bring his project to life. He provided them with all the necessary equipment and said that he would also work with them. At first, the builders were against the hero taking part in their stormy activities. But the price of the issue turned out to be small enough to solve this dilemma. All it took was a couple of bottles and a couple of plates. Suddenly, during one of their get-togethers, sand flew at the head of one of the workers. Old man Kim was extremely unhappy and shouted that they were making noise and drinking here every day, after which he asked if they even had permission to do this. Thomas was of course unhappy with his interference, but there was nothing he could do about it. He himself did not understand whether the old man's behavior was due to the possessiveness inherent in the outback or not, but he saw no other reasons. None of them guessed that the reason why this lonely old man was constantly bothering them was completely different. Kim simply lacked attention. So every time he came up with something new to attract the attention of others, this time he even lay down on the ground in front of the tractor, not letting it go further. Ivan's patience, standing next to Tom, was already running out, so he decided that it was time to finally explain to the old man that it would be better for him not to interfere, but the hero stopped him. He snatched the axe from the man's hand. Afterwards, with a threatening look in his eyes, he sternly said that he would deal with everything himself. The hero miraculously managed to preserve the grains of his own patience and convinced the team to continue working, ignoring Kim. Returning from the store that same evening, he witnessed a rather unpleasant scene. A car stopped near old man Kim's house and a man and a woman got out. The man insisted that the old man transfer the land to him in exchange for promising to take care of him. When Kim refused, the man began to shout, wondering why the old man was being so stubborn. In a fit of emotion, he grabbed him by the chest and pulled him towards himself. Edgar expressed his dissatisfaction with the fact that the old man gave the best lands to his sister, and he was left with only rice fields and a dilapidated house. Filled with anger, the man threw his father away from him, and he hit his back painfully on the protruding stones on the ground. Our hero's patience, which was on the brink, snapped at the sight of this scene. Groaning and clutching his back, old man Kim tried to rise. Edgar expected that after this he would agree to rewrite the lands. But when this did not happen, he took a swing at the old man, once again voicing his proposal. Thomas walked closer to them and cleared his throat, drawing their attention to himself. Then he gave Edgar a cold, expressive look, saying that he had better not do what he had planned. The man quietly cursed under his breath and waved his hand, sending everyone here to hell. Finally, he said that if he didn't get his land, he would burn everything here to the ground. Having said this, he got back into the car and drove away. Seeing the car disappearing over the horizon, Thomas sighed heavily. Then he turned his gaze to the old man, who had become much sadder. He offered him a cigarette, and the hero agreed, sitting down next to him. Thomas was the first to break the tense silence, asking why the old man didn't want to sell the land and move, since it was quite difficult to manage such an area on his own. He looked into the void in front of him, taking his time answering. A few moments later, he finally answered, saying that originally the part of the land given to his daughter was a useless wasteland, just like this one. He couldn't even predict that the government would decide to build a 10-lane highway there. Old man Kim smiled sadly, repeating the question of Thomas, who was sitting next to him. The image of his deceased wife, smiling happily, appeared before his eyes, and he said that he could never give this land to anyone. He has too many dear memories here that help him live on. The old man slowly stood up, saying that they had been sitting too long and it was time for them to go home. His unsmoked cigarette remained lying there. Thomas remained, looking at the old man's retreating back. After this conversation, old man Kim's heart opened a little. He stopped interfering with the workers doing their jobs. Thus, day after day passed, Thomas sitting with the old man from time to time and exchanging a few words. And finally, that very day X came. What happened in the city did not pass by the nearby settlements. A deafening roar shook the earth, and immediately after it, a belated siren announced the end of the world. Without delay, Thomas immediately rushed into his newly built bunker. Suddenly, an old man called out to him, and in a trembling voice he said that his son lived in Seoul and asked him to find him. He was in real horror and despair. The information he had read earlier immediately surfaced in the hero's memory. Looking at the old man, he replied that his son had already died, and there was no point in looking for him. These words cut painfully into Kim's heart, and he lowered his head and clutched his hat, which he held in his hand with all his strength. Thomas looked at him with a bit of sympathy and said that there would soon be a second wave of bombing, so he suggested that he hide in the bunker. The old man patted him on the shoulder and said sadly that he would not be able to leave his house. And thanking him for this offer, he quietly went back. Thomas hid in his bunker, surviving the disaster that had begun. Let's go back 2 years. Thomas would occasionally go hunting with old man Kim, and this time they managed to shoot a wild boar. It wasn't difficult for the hero to dig a little deeper and find out that his neighbor was a military man in the past. He also noticed that the old man always carried an old Walter with him, which was incredibly useful, but it could hardly save him from the coming horrors. Our hero carefully monitored his surroundings, not relaxing his vigilance for a moment. He also kept glancing towards the Air Force Base. Both Korean and American troops were stationed there at the same time. They also included hunters, a squad specializing in fighting various monsters. Michael considered this base an excellent condition to acquire suitable weapons. Thomas had even already developed a fairly simple plan. When the war starts, he planned to immediately target the base. After the explosion, there will be complete chaos, so the hero will put on the OZK and calmly take what he needs. While the hero was thinking through further details, an unexpected opportunity found him when he was suddenly offered to buy a gun. It was one of his workers named Sergei. From conversations, he learned that the man was Chinese but had moved to Korea and had previously been in a gang. Thomas also managed to find out that Sergei still maintains contact with his old colleagues from the gang. From the very beginning, the hero was wary of him, carefully analyzing all the newly received information. So when Sergei suggested that he get a gun, he thought about it. A few moments later, he nodded slightly and extended his hand to the man. Afterwards, Thomas replied that he would look at what Sergei offered him, but only after the construction was completed. A couple of months later, the day of sale arrived. During this time, our hero managed to hire a private detective, and with his help found out that Sergei was in no way connected with the bandits from the Korean group, but was a member of the Shanghai Triad and the goods were taken from there. But Thomas didn't care about any of this. Soon, Sergei himself appeared at the designated place and called the hero closer. Afterwards, the man pointed behind him, saying that his guys would soon bring the goods, but for now they needed to wait. They waited for the goods in silence. Sergei's attention was focused on the phone, and Thomas was thinking about his own things, glancing at his former employee from time to time. Suddenly, Sergei received a message. The hero carefully looked into the screen of the man standing next to him and asked if this was really his daughter. He awkwardly scratched the back of his head and replied that she had recently turned 7 and was constantly asking how soon he would return home. A few moments later, a van pulled into the street. Sergei took a few steps forward, saying that the goods had already been delivered. As they approached, several people came out to meet them and brought out the goods they had brought. One of the men explained that there were 3 rifles, type 56 and caliber 7.6, and 300 rounds of ammunition. Thomas looked over the goods thoughtfully and, bending down, picked up one of the rifles. He examined it carefully and concluded that the weapon was in fairly good condition. Having finished his inspection, he returned the rifle to its place. Meanwhile, Sergei was talking with his guys. A joyful smile shone on his face. Feeling Thomas's gaze on her, the smile immediately disappeared. He walked towards him with sharp steps and a threatening expression on his face, and reminded the hero of his words about how he was going to live alone in the bunker. Upon hearing this, Thomas immediately became wary. He followed with his gaze how Sergei's palm covered the rifle. The man himself assumed that it would most likely be difficult for him alone. The hero frowned slightly and said that sometimes there are problems, but overall it's not that bad. Sergei looked at him seriously, thinking about something. Noticing this, Thomas smiled and asked if he really wanted to help him. He himself quietly put his hand behind his back and touched the hatchet hidden in his clothes. Sergei was silent for a few moments, considering his proposal. But then he smiled and politely declined. He held his palms out in front of him and said that he would not dare violate Thomas's personal boundaries. Then he turned to the van, saying that if anything happened, Thomas now knew who to contact, and added that he would send him the cartridges and clips after payment was made. The hero remained in his place, looking at the car as it moved away. He was sure that Sergei would return to do what he could not do today. Our hero's fears came true, and this happened on the very first day of the disaster. Thomas turned his gaze from the screen of his mobile phone, which Sergei was constantly calling, to the screen of the monitor with cameras. He saw a man get out of a car parked nearby. In his hand was a sharpened axe. Thomas already imagined his next step because Sergei knew the layout of this bunker perfectly, since he himself had built it. He turned his heavy gaze back to the phone screen, after which he pressed the answer button and held the phone to his ear. As soon as this happened, Sergei jumped up. When Thomas asked what he wanted, he replied that he had simply decided to deliver the package to him personally. The hero didn't answer him, analyzing the situation. Afterwards, he put the phone aside, cutting off the connection, and picked up an axe, deciding that there would be no problem since there was only one opponent. He walked slowly out, clutching the weapon in his hands. Sergei didn't have to wait long to press. Thomas was determined to deal with him as soon as possible before any more uninvited guests arrived. His gaze was cold and dangerous, like that of a predator patiently waiting for its prey. Sergei decided not to hesitate and almost immediately rushed at him, swinging an axe. But Thomas ducked, successfully avoiding the blow. Afterwards, he quickly moved behind the enemy, and without a second's delay, he attacked, striking at the neck. At that very moment, a deep wound appeared on Sergei's body from which blood spurted. Thomas decided not to stop there and raised his axe again to strike. Bleeding, Sergei grabbed the wound on his neck with his hand and wheezed, asking the hero who he was, if he was really a secret soldier of the special services. He lowered his other free hand to the ground, helping himself not to fall. Instead of answering, Thomas gave him a cold look. If just a few moments ago Sergei was completely confident of his victory, now the situation has changed dramatically. Still wheezing and writhing in pain, Sergei grabbed him by the leg and began to beg for help. The hero stood silently for a few moments. Afterwards, he said dryly that he would hardly be able to do anything. At the end, he added that even if he didn't finish him off, Sergei himself would die from blood loss. Exhaling loudly, the man whispered that in that case he would prefer death at the hands of Thomas. The hero fulfilled the last request without a drop of regret. He made sure that Sergei met his end quickly. Suddenly, his attention was caught by the sound of a ringing bell. Thomas knelt down next to the body and reached for the vibrating pocket. He was afraid that Sergei had brought someone else here. However, it was not the man's accomplices who called him, but his daughter. The hero remembered that Sergei had a little daughter whom he told him about. Having unlocked the phone, Thomas immediately came across their correspondence, in which the man he had killed promised to return home as quickly as possible. A month has passed since then, and as soon as the radiation level dropped a little, our hero immediately went to the Air Force Base. He walked among the ruins of destroyed buildings and looked around carefully. Suddenly, something caught his attention and made him stop. He was lucky enough to find El Dorado, a weapon powerful enough to deal with an entire group of mercenaries. Thomas walked slowly inside the building, happy that his original plan had worked like a charm. On the way, he noticed a parked car. It contained the charred skeletons of unfortunate victims of a nuclear bombing. In a way, Thomas felt sorry for them, but he was powerless to change anything, so he turned around and moved on. Having done everything he needed to, Thomas left the base. From time to time, the image of Sergei would pop up in his thoughts. He wondered what would have happened if this man had not met him and whether he would have been able to reunite with his daughter. But looking at the landscape surrounding him, all the pictures of a happy family painted by his imagination were shattered on the rocks of reality. It would have been simply impossible to survive in such an environment. In his free time, of which he now had a lot, our hero did handicrafts, making dolls out of felt. He repeated every step exactly as shown in the video. This video was made after the start of the nuclear war by an anonymous person under the nickname 337. This became possible thanks to a community of people who believed in the end of the world. One big businessman launched a satellite into orbit, and so even after the war, people still had the opportunity to use the internet and keep in touch with each other. Thomas was extremely focused on the matter, and this kind of hobby helped him to distract himself and relax for a while. The man in the video explained how to properly secure the protruding parts, and a few moments later he presented the result, a cute little sheep. Thomas turned his attentive gaze to the monitor, examining the toy. His own creation was on a completely different level and clearly did not reach the level of a toy. This undoubtedly upset Michael. Thus, a whole year has passed since the beginning of the war. Although there were no more bombings, a completely new threat appeared. Monsters have taken over the entire region, and the government has completely lost control of the situation. The old life has become a long-forgotten dream. Also, on the forum lately, there has been more and more talk about refugees. The number of people who had not been online for a long time also increased significantly, and soon suspicions turned into fear and hatred. Thomas read another dispute on the forum and became more and more convinced of this. He understood that these emotions were not without reason. By clicking on the button, he blocked the user named Defender in the chat so as not to see his posts. Immediately after the war began, a man appeared who was nicknamed the Manhunter on the forum. He posted numerous accounts of his exploits. It was obvious that he was not killing for fun at all. The real reason was much simpler and more prosaic. It was a warning. However, when the hero pulled this man from the blacklist to view his latest posts, he realized that the hunter had become addicted to killing. And now anyone who follows his posts on a regular basis will become aggressive and suspicious. A few days later, he received a shocking notification that anonymous person 337, who made the toys, had not been online for a long time. It wasn't hard to guess what this could mean. Thus, another 6 months passed and a harsh winter came. The number of inactive users has exceeded the number of active ones many times over. Everyone had already gotten used to the fact that people were constantly disappearing and no one knew when their turn would come, including our hero, so he was extremely wary. While on patrol today, he noticed a truck with 4 men approaching his base. Looking closer, he recognized them as the builders who had helped build his shelter. Soon the truck stopped and the men got off, holding their guns at the ready. Thomas realized that the 4 had gone on a looting spree and were revisiting their old clients. A grin appeared on the hero's face. Turning around, he returned back to his shelter. Having reached the necessary locker, the hero stopped. Opening it, he glanced over the array of weapons collected there, deciding that he should welcome his guests as hospitably as possible. With these thoughts, he chose the axe that had already become familiar to him. Meanwhile, the men also reached the bunker, but they were alarmed by the fact that the entrance door was open. Turning around, Paul ordered the 2 men following him to go forward and scout out the situation. Without objection, they immediately went inside the bunker. They looked around cautiously and were ready to attack at any moment as soon as they noticed a threat. Suddenly, something caught Nick's attention and he stopped. As the light from the flashlight illuminated the many boxes of food, he couldn't help but let out a cry of delight. Paul, following behind him, looked around again and said that he didn't like it at all because he had a nagging feeling that they were being lured into a trap. When Pavel, who remained at the entrance, asked if everything was clear, Paul replied that no danger had been detected yet. Then he shouted for them to go deeper and look around, because there must definitely be someone inside. At that very moment, our hero jumped from the ceiling, aiming at Nick, who was carrying a protective shield. Thomas hit the shield straight on, causing the man to cry out in surprise and fall to the floor, crushing his partner underneath him. Paul didn't lose his head and, aiming his gun, began to shoot at the hero, but he easily dodged, simultaneously throwing an axe at the enemy. Nick watched in horror as his opponent was hacked to death with an axe. Thomas took advantage of this moment and jumped on the shield, pushing the man underneath him into the floor. When the tension suddenly eased, Nick peered out from behind the shield cautiously. As soon as he did this, he saw Thomas raise the picked-up axe over his head to strike. Seized with horror, Nick began to beg him for mercy. But our hero was not so merciful, so all the pleas fell on deaf ears. Having killed him, Thomas turned towards the entrance when Pavel's excited voice was heard from there. He slowly walked towards the entrance. Meanwhile, Pavel, who was on the street, asked his partner to throw a couple of tear gas canisters inside. Thomas heard their plans perfectly well, thanks to the fact that he was hiding nearby at the entrance. However, he was not so simple as to surrender to the enemy so easily. The next moment, he hit the button on the wall nearby with his fist with an axe in his hand. A malicious grin appeared on his face. Being on his own territory, our hero had a couple of aces up his sleeve for such cases. The door automatically slammed shut with a bang. The men standing outside did not have time to put their plan into action. Pavel suggested finding a ventilation shaft and smoking out the enemy through it. He said that there was only one entrance to this bunker, and in fact, there was only one exit. If they threw a couple of grenades into the ventilation, Thomas would be trapped. At this time, the hero returned back to the weapons cabinet and took the rifle. Afterwards, he pushed the locker aside, thinking that he never thought that a fight against ordinary marauders would turn into such problems. However, his enemies didn't know something either. After the builders finished their work, Thomas expanded the bunker himself, relying on his knowledge. So they have no idea that there is another way out here. It took Thomas a little less than 2 minutes to reach it. Opening the door, he stepped outside. Afterwards, he looked around, trying to find his target with his eyes. The hero walked extremely carefully so as not to attract attention to himself ahead of time, focusing on the voices coming from nearby. Meanwhile, Luke had already pulled the pin from the grenade. At that moment, Thomas came out from behind a tree and shot at the man. It hit him right in the head, causing confusion and shock among his 2 comrades. Pavel didn't understand what was happening and watched with surprise on his face as Luke fell dead, and then another one fell from the shot. Looking at Thomas, he raised his hands and shouted that he surrendered. The hero coldly asked how many more of them were here. Pavel closed his eyes and replied that he was the last one. But the hero did not believe his words and put the gun to the man's forehead. His eyes immediately widened in horror, and he said that there were only 5 of them, including him. So there was no one else left here. With Thomas's gun pointed at him, Pavel carried all the bodies into the truck. Suddenly, something caught our hero's attention. Shock was frozen on his face. Lowering his rifle, he walked closer to the truck and began to feel around its bottom with his hand, causing Pavel to become puzzled. A few moments later, he pulled out a familiar bloody toy sheep. At the sight of her, anger instantly overwhelmed him. Grabbing the rifle with both hands, he hit Pavel on the head with it, causing him to fall to the ground. Afterwards, with a clear threat in his voice, he asked what they had done with the man who was the owner of this doll. The man immediately waved his hand, saying that Thomas had misunderstood everything. The hero didn't find this answer very convincing, so Pavel received another strong blow. Then he grabbed him by the chest with one hand, lifting him up slightly. Covering himself with his hands, the man shouted that they had not killed anyone in the shelter. When they got there was only one dead old man, and they had only cleaned out the shelter and left. Thomas asked Pavel to take him to that bunker, and 30 minutes later, a truck ride later, they were there. The hero was pleasantly surprised that this place was so close. It was not difficult for him to recognize the bunker from the anonymous video 337 at first glance. When they went inside, they saw a bloody body not far from the entrance. His head was wrapped in film, and on it was a sticker with the inscription Defender, which the hunter leaves on each of his victims. The hero heard the sound of a shot as if it were real. He slowly turned his head towards the imaginary killer. He finished his work and walked away with a smile on his face. Thomas was adamant that the hunter was also behind this death. And since this shelter was found, it was only a matter of time before his bunker was discovered too. Our hero lingered here a little longer, carefully examining the corpse. He knew better than anyone that corpses could tell a lot more than they might seem at first glance. Thomas was instantly flooded with memories of his past as a military man. Thanks to his rich experience and good observation, the hero could accurately determine not only the cause of death, but also the conditions in which the victim found himself at the time of death. It was not difficult for him to establish even the patterns of the criminal's behavior. He had been doing this kind of work for many years. Therefore, he was also able to determine the attitude towards the death of the current criminal quite easily. Pavel, who had been standing quietly to the side all this time, carefully asked if Thomas would let him go now. Instead of answering, he pointed the gun at him, causing confusion in the man who put his palms in front of him, saying that he had already done everything that was required of him. Seeing that there was no reaction to his words, he shouted that he also had reasons for doing this, because he had children, and without him, they would die. But even these words did not touch Thomas. He still kept the gun aimed. Pavel began to slowly back away, pressing on the children's pity. When the hero got tired of this, he said that there was a small misunderstanding, because he would never spare a marauder who knew the location of his bunker. For Pavel, these words sounded like a sentence, which was carried out at that very moment by Thomas. After which our hero left the bunker, leaving the bodies there. A few months later, spring came and our hero began to go outside more often. He had lived in the bunker too long and had come to appreciate the warm, fresh air outside, enjoying the blissful peace in the sun. At such moments, Thomas felt like this place was a real paradise on earth. However, nothing can last long, and the hero understood this. Filled with a strange premonition, Thomas opened his eyes and saw a drone flying in the sky. He slowly approached him. Not long ago, someone wrote on the forum that he also saw a flying drone in the sky, and now someone is trying to break into his bunker using welding and also warned that he is going to blow up his bunker in case of emergency. This post attracted a lot of attention and also helped to reveal a frightening truth to everyone. Namely, that the marauders are becoming more and more inventive and cunning. They can also try on the masks of members of the surviving community. Therefore, the information that is necessary for survival may one day become their undoing. On the day this post came out, every survivor realized this. Just like they will have to fight for their own lives, whether they want to or not. Over time, some began to unite into groups. Group survival quickly gained popularity. Our hero had a completely different opinion regarding all this, because he believed that a large group was easier to notice or track down. He considered stealth to be the best way to survive. It gave him more advantages over the enemy. In this regard, Thomas's territory is ideal for this method, because there is so little here that neither marauders nor vagabonds simply have any reason to come here. Also, recently a pack of mutated wild dogs settled nearby. From the forum, our hero also learned that radioactive zombies had begun to appear in a nearby city. There were even rumors about an unknown survivor who was cleaning up this city. He shoots them with a sniper rifle, piercing the zombies' heads. But Thomas suspected that this was not all the changes and that something worse was coming. Greg, holding the drone's remote control, swore loudly. They arrived exactly at the place where our hero had been resting not so long ago, but now it was as if he had disappeared into thin air. The man looked out of the truck window and asked his comrades with displeasure whether they had searched carefully enough or if they had simply gotten the wrong place. Patrick, equally displeased, shouted that there were no other Air Force bases nearby and told Greg to send out the drone again. He cursed with displeasure, dreaming of the pleasure he would have in getting rid of Thomas when he found him. Suddenly, something caught his attention. He looked down at the image from the drone, amazed at what he saw. Instead of Thomas, he came across a stranger with a rifle. Judging by her clothes, Greg was sure that she was an American soldier. Pleased with this, he looked out the window again and shouted that he had found a better victim and they needed to turn around. But before he could finish speaking, he noticed the frozen horror on the faces of his comrades. They were attacked by mutated wild dogs. Right before Greg's eyes, they devoured everyone outside one by one. This horrific sight left the man in shock. The man in the driver's seat immediately hit the pedals, getting out of there as quickly as possible. Suddenly, the torn body of one of their former comrades flew under their wheels. The man landed on their car with a thud, hitting the windshield. It instantly cracked, completely obscuring the driver's vision, and the truck crashed into a pole. Greg did not survive the accident, but Paul, who was driving, miraculously survived. However, the joy of survival did not last long. Horror was reflected on his face, distorted by pain. A huge monster's head penetrated inside. It was no trouble for the wild dog to devour the immobilized victim. Afterwards, a photo from the accident site was uploaded to the forum with a caption stating that wild animals had dragged a group of marauders towards the forest. Thomas, however, decided that he should be more careful if he didn't want to accidentally run into the mutant dogs. Suddenly, while he was sitting and thinking about this post, he received a message from the user who had previously written that he had been tracked down and was going to blow up his bunker. This time, he wrote again about the explosion and asked for help, but after the last time, no one believed him. So when the looters broke into the bunker, despair overwhelmed him, and he had no choice but to actually blow everything up. Almost everyone heard the explosion, and the forum came alive again, discussing what had happened. Thomas decided that he didn't need to delve into this now, because there were more important things to do. Or rather, a threat that got too close to him. He picked up the drone's control panel, which depicted a girl with a rifle. Thomas decided it was time for him to meet his neighbors. Alexa noticed a drone following her, so she immediately got rid of it. Later in the evening, Thomas visited the place where he last saw the girl from the video and stopped at a half-survived high-rise building. He glanced around the building with a careful gaze. Alexa reacted instantly, firing her rifle. The bullet flew straight at the American woman's approaching enemy. The zombie was knocked down by this one attack. Thomas managed to hide behind the bus. Now he had no way back. He entered the territory of his neighbor, a mad sniper. Carefully emerging from his hiding place, the hero dropped to one knee and began to carefully examine something on the ground. His attention was drawn to the bullets in the ground. Thomas found it strange that the warning shot holes were too close to the aimed ones, which only meant that Alexa had no choice but to shoot. This guess gave him the idea that this girl was in some sense even more dangerous than that bomber. The hero originally came here to learn more about his neighbor, whom he found using a drone. Based on the girl's appearance and her equipment, Thomas was certain that she was a member of the U.S. military forces stationed in Korea. At the very beginning of the war, the United States, being in the position of the strongest country in the world, intercepted most of the nuclear missiles and protected the main territory, but the main problems began later. They withdrew all their external combat assets, including those from Korea. They had to try to defend themselves from the rifts from which the monsters were crawling out. While Alexa was here, our hero understood that he would not be able to have full control over the Air Force base and calmly conduct reconnaissance. He would like to avoid clashes with trained soldiers, but if someone enters his territory, then a clash cannot be avoided. He has no intention of living with a threat at his side. The hero guarded this multi-story building for about a week. During this time, he managed to study the enemy's behavior patterns. The first thing he noticed was that the shooting stopped at about the same time every day. Thomas assumed that this was the time Alex went to bed, and that this was the only time he could approach the building without getting shot. As he had already found out, the entrance was blocked by a barricade, so he had only one option to get inside, namely through the roof of another building, which he took advantage of, boldly jumping from the roof to the opposite side. He managed to successfully grab onto the ledge of the floor of the desired building. Thomas glanced down. If he fails to climb up and falls down, he will most likely run into the protruding pins. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. In the next movement, the hero climbed onto a hard surface with one jerk. Thomas immediately grabbed his weapon and took aim, ready for the fact that he could be attacked at any moment. However, he found no one here, so he walked forward carefully, trying not to make unnecessary noise. Thomas was extremely focused and alert. In this way, he reached the stairs and began to climb up them just as carefully. Having climbed one flight, he stopped, looking around for enemies. In this way, he reached the top floor where the sniper's hideout was located. He quietly approached the door and opened it, walking inside. The first thing Thomas saw in front of him was a man sleeping in a sleeping bag a couple of meters away from him. Suddenly, Alexa appeared behind him with an aimed rifle and ordered him to lower the weapon. Thomas didn't expect to be lured into a trap. He lowered his gun and raised his free hand up. The hero glanced cautiously at the American woman, wondering when she had noticed him. Judging by her voice, he assumed that this was the girl he had seen from the drone. Realizing that his opponent was not simple, Thomas remained on guard and did not take his finger off the trigger. Alex repeated with emphasis in her voice once again for him to put the weapon on the floor. But Thomas did not react. Continuing to analyze the situation, he noticed for himself that the girl was standing relatively close to him and that she was definitely not holding a gun in her hands because the barrel was quite long. He sighed, released his grip, and his weapon fell to the floor. But the next moment, he turned sharply, grabbing the barrel of Alexa's rifle with his hand. The girl fired, hoping to hit Thomas, but he dodged without lowering his hand from the weapon. While Alexa continued shooting, the hero got a little closer to her. He then kicked her in the thigh, trying to weaken his opponent's stance. But when that didn't work, he hit her under the knee. The girl's legs immediately buckled and she screamed in pain. Alexa lay on the floor, breathing heavily and holding onto her aching leg with her hand. Suppressing the pain, she crawled forward to pick up the weapon. But Thomas interrupted her plans by stepping on her lower back. The hero measured the girl beneath him with a cold gaze. She couldn't even say anything because of the pain. Sighing, the hero said that he didn't want this to happen. Initially, he only planned to check how many people were here. But while he was examining the building, he came across an arsenal and he really wouldn't want local looters to ever get to it. Alexa gave him a displeased look, saying nothing. Thomas also frowned and, aiming his gun at her, said that if she wanted to live so much, then she should have sat quietly, and the blame for her carelessness lay only with her. Suddenly, the hero heard a rustling sound behind him and reacted instantly, taking out a pistol with his free hand and pointing it towards the entrance. Despite Alexa's cries of protest, the steps grew closer, and soon the stranger himself entered. Thomas was surprised when he saw a little girl in front of him, timidly walking towards him. Michelle looked at her mother in surprise, who was under the gun's sights, and froze. The hero was confused and lost his concentration for a few moments. This was enough for Alex to turn around and punch Thomas's hand with the gun. He jumped aside, surprised that the American woman still had the strength to resist, while she also managed to arm herself with a pistol. Thomas decided that he needed to finish her off before she was ready to defend herself, so he aimed his gun at her with determination. However, the next moment, something happened that he never expected. Alexa rushed towards her daughter, hugging her. The hero slowly turned his uncomprehending gaze towards them. He thought the girl would jump for the rifle, as this would increase both her and her daughter's chances of survival, but she did otherwise. Thomas sighed heavily. Realizing that his assumption about a mad sniper was wrong, Alexa simply found herself in an untamed jungle, in which she was desperately trying to survive. She managed to survive in a foreign country while protecting her daughter only because she pulled the trigger at the first sign of danger. Thomas approached her and knocked the gun out of her hand with one blow. Then he pointed towards the streets and said that land belonged to him. He gestured with a gun, saying that if she went in there, she would die. Nodding towards the girl, the hero added that Alexa should not stick her nose in there, but sit here and keep an eye on the child. Although the American woman was in no hurry to answer, he was sure that she should have understood this. Suddenly, she asked if he had any medicine. When he asked why they needed them, Alexa lifted her left pant leg, revealing bloody bandages wrapped around it. Even with the naked eye, it was clear that the wound was serious. Thomas took something out of his pocket and threw it to the girl, saying that these were antibiotics and anti-inflammatories that should help. Alexa carefully examined the box with the drug. Looking up at the boy in front of her, she said that that wasn't what she meant. The American woman bit her lip and asked if the hero had any drugs. He was surprised by her question. In part, he could understand her. Naturally, in such a situation, one wants to find any comfort, even if it is illusory. Looking Alex in the eyes, the hero said that drugs are not a cure for all diseases and a good ending awaited no one with them. He then pointed to Michelle and asked if she knew Korean. From that day on, Thomas began to support the two, regularly delivering medications and skim milk to them at the agreed-upon location. He also noted that in recent days there have been significantly more shots. Although the frequency of the shots was high, it did not resemble a shootout. Even on the day of their first meeting, Thomas realized that Alexa was already on the edge. And with each new day, her condition gets worse. She doesn't hit the enemies in her sights, but the demons in her head. Suddenly, a bright beam blinded him. Thomas stopped and looked towards the already familiar building, in the window of which something was glittering. He almost immediately recognized the Morse code that Alex used to tell him about the meeting place. However, her daughter came to the meeting instead of her. The hero immediately noticed her worried expression. Michelle explained in Korean that her mother was not feeling well, after which she led him into the building where Alexa was. Thomas immediately noted that their entire shelter was littered with all sorts of American symbols, from the flag to movie posters. Noticing their appearance, Alexa rose from the floor. Afterwards, the hero helped her bandage the wound, and the girl explained the situation in a mixture of English and Korean. The hero understood that everything was very bad, because the marauders were increasingly flocking to the sounds of gunfire, and the wounds on his leg were getting worse due to the delayed treatment. When the bandaging was finished, Michelle sank down next to her mother, wrapping her in a tight embrace. Suddenly, Alexa admitted with sadness in her voice that she missed home. She remembered the friends and acquaintances she left there. The American woman understood that it was simply impossible to return home in the current situation, and this really hurt her heart. Michelle brushed away a lone tear that rolled down her chin. Without turning to face him, Alexa asked Thomas again if he had any drugs. His gaze immediately became heavy. Memories of the tragic fate of another family, which he accidentally witnessed, surfaced in his mind. Afterwards, he said that even if he had them, he would not have given them to her, because no matter how much you run away from reality, the problems will still not go away. In return, he promised to help her. But for this, he will need a weapon. Sometime later, our hero found a refuge for marauders. He waited for the rain on purpose because it was the best moment to leave his territory. The rain severely limits visibility, and the cold forces people to huddle in groups around the fire. Thomas looked around and noticed boxes of ammunition nearby. Among them, he found flare guns, which would be very useful to him now. The hero took out one of them, equipping his weapon. Even though the enemy had an advantage in numbers, Thomas could easily get rid of this problem with the help of missiles. The men sitting by the fire were closest to him, so they became his first target. The rocket he launched caused a powerful explosion. Although the number of injured opponents was great, he had expected more. Those who were not caught in the explosion ran as far away from here as possible. But Thomas couldn't let them do that. Having changed weapons, he fired continuously at the enemies. They tried to hide or run away, but the same end awaited them. Suddenly, Thomas noticed someone approaching from the side. He instantly turned around and began shooting at the enemies who had crept up on him. One of the marauders opened fire and, aiming at Thomas, shot through his cloak. The men tried their best to hit him, but the hero was faster and avoided the bullets. When he disappeared from the sight of the marauders, they were confused, wondering where he had disappeared to and how many people had come with him. The leader of the marauders ordered one of the men to go for help, and he immediately went towards the trucks. At that very moment, the leader's head was shot. Another man followed him, and only Jack, who had been sent for help, remained alive. After stopping the shooting, Thomas emerged from the shadows and began to slowly approach Jack. He said that the more they reach for the light in such a tense situation, the more exposed they become. In horror, Jack tripped over his own feet and fell to the ground. All the deaths he saw and the axe that Thomas held in his hand told him that he would not leave here alive. The hero stopped next to the man and raised his axe to strike, saying that he wanted to finish this quickly and return home. As soon as everything was over, he returned back to the bunker. He also invited Anna and Michelle with him, because it would be more convenient for him to take care of them for some time. The girl walked around and looked at everything with interest. When she asked Thomas why the toilet was in the very center of the room, he told her to sit next to her mother and not ask unnecessary questions. He himself continued bandaging Alexa's leg. A couple of minutes later, everything was ready. All this time, Michelle continued to explore the room, looking into various nightstands, which caused great irritation to our hero. Sighing, he turned his attention back to Alexa getting dressed and said that he had done everything according to the video, so everything should be fine. The girl said nothing in response to this. The hero strongly doubted that she would immediately feel better because he could only heal external wounds, but not mental ones. While thinking about this, he looked into his open laptop and suddenly it dawned on him. Alexa followed his gaze. Thomas moved his laptop a little closer to her, allowing her to look at the screen. He showed the English version of the Long Live the Apocalypse forum. The hero assumed that since the American domain was the main one, there should be many times more users there. He hoped that at least this way he would be able to dull the pain in Alexa's heart. The girl had never used this forum and hesitantly asked if it was somehow connected with the States. In response, Thomas nodded and advised her to try writing something there. After his words, she turned her gaze back to the screen. Afterwards, she timidly touched the keyboard with her fingers and typed a banal greeting. Even though it was a small thing, a smile appeared on Alexa's face for the first time in a long time. Time moved inexorably forward, and now the second Christmas after the apocalypse has arrived. Recently, the free game Decorate the Christmas Tree, made by a former developer, has gained popularity. Our hero's tree was almost empty and it wasn't popular, but the trees of famous users were littered with comments, one of which was hung with balloons with the inscriptions corpse, murder, psychopath, killer. The hero was interested in looking through similar trees of other users from time to time. Suddenly, Michelle's voice came over the radio. Thomas immediately asked how Alexa was. The girl replied that she had fallen asleep, but wanted to borrow the laptop for a while to spend the New Year's countdown with people from North America. The day he first gave Alexa a laptop, she visibly perked up and thanked him for the opportunity he had given her. Then she said her name and her daughter's name. Thomas decided not to give his name, but to settle on a nickname from the forum. Since then, the hero has been in constant contact with these two. When he replied that he would bring it soon and was about to turn off, Michelle asked him to wait a little, after which she took a deep breath and wished him a Merry Christmas. The hero hadn't heard anything like this for a long time, so he was very surprised at first. A few moments later, a slight smile touched his lips. He also wished them a Merry Christmas. Suddenly, Thomas received a message that someone had decorated his tree. At the very top, a red ball appeared with the inscription John Nennon. This name was familiar to our hero, and he was surprised that he had the chance to meet him again. He was immediately interested in who had drawn a parallel between him and the owner of this name. After all, this ghost was known to many people, but especially to Thomas. Let's go back 2.5 years when the online community Long Live the Apocalypse was just created. Its server was located on a separate satellite, and all the illegal information that was justified by its subject matter was located there. This largest anonymous resource dedicated to the apocalypse was used by people from all over the world. It was promoted in various ways, and our hero also became interested in it. However, he couldn't afford to buy a subscription right away, and he didn't see the point in spending money to read all the show-offs of the rich. Thomas initially started using this forum because it was difficult to cook something on his own, but he was unable to find any useful information on the forum. So he decided to invest his money in a bunker. Suddenly, an article with an interesting title caught his eye. It was the first time he came across John Nennon's post about the need for fake bunkers. It was written there that when it comes to long-term survival, the tactical and strategic advantage provided by such bunkers is difficult to overestimate. They could be connected to the main bunker and used for reconnaissance and surveillance purposes, or simply to mislead the enemy. It was also recommended to mine them in advance if the bunker was captured. Thomas found this article incredibly useful and interesting. He looked through several more of John's articles, in which he found many varied and extremely well-thought-out things, and the hero also noticed that the author of the post's philosophy of survival was similar to his own. This man interested him, and Thomas became interested in finding out what John Nennon was doing. Not only he, but also many other forum users became interested in him, but revealing John's mysterious identity turned out to be not so easy. Thomas followed every new discussion and post closely. One day, John finally responded to the forum users. From the attached photo of the ID, the hero realized that this man was a hunter. About 10 years ago, strange phenomena began to appear all over the world, which people called rifts. Soon, terrible creatures began to appear from the rifts, and each country began to create a squad to fight them. They began to be called hunters. These people fought tirelessly against the monsters that appeared from the rifts. The very first such detachment in Korea consisted of only 4 people. Our hero was a part of it. As the monster approached, his 3 partners immediately aimed their weapons at the enemy and began firing. The hero wielded the axe mercilessly. No one relaxed their vigilance after killing the enemy because everyone knew that it was not the end. The identities of the top-class hunters were kept as a state secret. Each of them was an elite soldier who had undergone the most brutal training in many battles. So looking at John's license, Thomas could say with certainty that he was not one of those hunters. But even so, the very existence of such a license contributed to a greater growth in its popularity. All this was supported by his broad knowledge, which was entirely in keeping with his position. Thus, John Nennon very quickly became the most famous figure in the whole society. But not everything was so smooth. Along with his popularity, he also gained many envious people. They pressed hard on his every post, looking for the slightest flaw. However, all these attacks were unfounded and would not leave even a stain on John's reputation. When users questioned his real identity, Thomas was interested in the reaction of his idol. He assumed that he would not respond to such obvious provocations. But to his surprise, John responded by posting a photo of himself. This photo only caused confusion and disappointment among people. Community interest has abruptly declined. It was later discovered that John only had a D rank, the lowest possible for a hunter. Thomas believed that John should have continued to simply post informational posts and not drown himself, but to the hero's surprise, he went even further. John Nennon organized a meeting with fans. Thus, a year before the disaster, the first fan meeting was held. John Nennon thanked everyone for coming here and then said that on the forum it was just his nickname, but in real life his name is Ian. Including our hero, there were only 10 people gathered at the table. When the waiter came to their table, John ordered enough pork belly for 9 people, citing his diet. The woman replied that there were 10 of them there and she only accepted orders per person, and he had to order a dish for 10. Thomas noted that although John had said earlier that he was sitting on the table, as soon as the food appeared on the table, he immediately pounced on the meat and beer. It seemed as if he had not eaten for several days or simply wanted to fully recoup his money. After this, 2 middle-aged men who, judging by their clothes, were quite wealthy, clicked their tongues in displeasure and left. The hero decided to stay longer. Their conversation smoothly turned to speculation about the coming war, which would most likely be unleashed by China, since they have serious problems with the faults and some internal units are rebelling, ignoring orders from the center. Thomas also noted that John was telling things that had long been known to everyone, and all his information was out of date by at least 6 months. The man's pink face spoke of the amount of alcohol he had drunk, and suddenly his gaze caught on our hero. As soon as Thomas mentioned his nickname from the forum, John immediately remembered it and asked how the construction in his bunker was progressing. The hero looked down and replied that new problems arise every day and he cannot find a company that makes decent fuel tanks. When John replied that he had heard about a similar problem and nothing immediately came to mind, Thomas became completely disappointed in him because he had already realized that in fact this man had neither knowledge nor connections and that he should not be expected to help. But John's next suggestion that he could take up the matter greatly surprised our hero. He took out his cell phone and said he could ask around and see if something would come up. Having said this, he began to look for the required number in his contacts. A couple of minutes later, he had already contacted one of his friends and said that he needed a company that dealt with fuel tanks. A month later, Thomas installed the fuel tank. Thanks to John's help, he managed to bring his bunker to mind. Despite the first bad impression, he turned out to be quite a useful acquaintance. Afterwards, John continued to hold his meetings, and at the last one, he managed to attract about 80 people. Thomas decided that this was his last meeting because he was already pretty tired of listening to the nonsense that was constantly being said here. Suddenly, John came up to him and asked if he had a couple of free minutes. The two of them went outside. The hero was in no hurry to start a conversation first, trying to understand what John wanted from him. After a few moments, the man spoke himself, saying that he had one question. He turned his gaze to Thomas and asked if he was a hunter. The hero simply looked at him for a few seconds, hesitating to answer. Then he asked if he really looked so much like a hunter. John replied that he had a strange feeling, as if he had seen Thomas before. He stood firm in his opinion, and the hero looked down, not reacting to his words. Thomas is confident that his identity as a hunter was strictly classified, so John could not have any information. And in order not to reveal himself, he needed to come up with something urgently. When he turned to him to voice his invented excuse, he was no longer there. The other guys came out of the establishment looking for John, saying that reporters had come here and wanted to see him. One of the men noticed Thomas standing nearby and asked what they were talking about. Without waiting for an answer, he pushed John towards the entrance, saying that if it was not something important, then he should hurry. John looked towards Thomas and wanted to say something, but didn't have time. The next moment, a female reporter appeared at the door. All the man's attention was immediately focused on her. He smiled and said that it looked like he really should hurry. Once, when someone asked why John was so busy with that guy, he replied that Thomas just looked like someone he knew. The hero did not follow the crowd but went home. This was their last meeting in person. John Nennan soon became a real star and appeared on many broadcasts as a representative of the apocalypse and an expert on the issue of the end of the world, thanks to which he further strengthened his position. Later, he even began giving lectures. He also monetized his fame as the doomsday seller to the fullest. He provided special consultations for the rich. John didn't just ride the wave, he worked his oars with all his might to rise even higher. And the main springboard for his success were the guys from the forum. John was intoxicated with his fame and power. After all, the forum users worshipped him like God, and he watched their reactions and began to believe that they would continue to follow him like sheep. But it was precisely this approach that became his end. Over time, the truth came out that he had copied all the posts from the European forum, and this caused a lot of indignation. As a result, an entire army of armchair detectives took up a detailed investigation, and the bubble called John Nennan burst. Thomas himself was irritated by the fact that this man was literally everywhere already, so he was glad that everything ended this way. Although John managed to take off quickly, he fell much faster, and the anonymous people from the forum who started the bullying made everything much worse. He made no attempt to defend himself in any way from unfortunate suspicions and criticism. The last sign of life he showed remained forever in the history of the forum. Thus, the rising star long live the apocalypse faded away. Now Thomas was looking thoughtfully at the monitor screen. He wondered who had drawn the parallel between the two of them. The thought that it was just a coincidence immediately crossed his mind, but instead a suspicion crept in that it could have been John Nennan himself. Thomas sat back down at the monitor, moving the keyboard closer. On the forum, he found the account he needed of one of the anonymous people and wrote to him. The hero asked if he could tell him who left the message on his tree. When he replied that he would think about it if Thomas told him why he needed it. Having told a couple of details, the hero leaned back in his chair, waiting for an answer. He knew that GameFox was a hacker and former game developer who made this game, so he had no doubt that he would be able to find out who it was. At that moment, Thomas had no idea what this curiosity would turn into for him. About half an hour later, the Game Fox sent him the name of the user who left the message, and the hero thanked him for his help. Immediately after this, he found the person he needed on the forum and, going into the chat, asked who he was, since they had definitely not crossed paths before. The threat hanging over the hero came from a direction he didn't even suspect. Sometime later, the National Crisis Management Authority made an announcement that they were reopening the disaster response headquarters. Having heard everything he needed, Thomas turned off the radio, after which he began to pack his bag, putting in food and water for 3 days. He also did not forget about weapons for self-defense. The state was still holding on thanks to the surviving top brass, but the hero did not place much hope in them. But while the concept of the nation still lived in the minds of people, Thomas could take advantage of this, which is why he was looking for a place for a bunker closer to the city. Having collected everything he needed, he looked over his clothes, making sure that they were the most ordinary and would not attract much attention. Having prematurely checked that there was no one near the bunker, Thomas decided to go outside. It's time for him to see what Seoul has become a year and a half after the nuclear bomb fell. The road to the city itself was rather boring, but as soon as he entered the city itself, strewn with ruins, the picture changed dramatically. This view evoked complex and contradictory emotions in the hero. All that remains of the Seoul that Thomas knew is its name. Thinking about this, a strong sadness came over him, but that was not all. When he saw other survivors who, having lost their homes, began to live on the destroyed streets, a joy arose deep in his soul that in the new world, he was who he was. In a small alley opposite, he noticed a mountain of corpses and people with canisters in green suits. They poured gasoline on the corpses and set them on fire. This picture did not surprise him because he had already witnessed something similar many times. Sometime later, he arrived at the building of the National Crisis Management Office. As he approached the information window, the woman sitting at the desk said in a boring voice that complaints and crime reports were submitted to a different window. The hero interrupted her and said that he wanted to meet with Director Leon Neal, which made the woman look up at him. Having said this, Thomas handed her his hunting ID. Afterwards, he said that he now had to deal with the aftermath of the disaster. He also asked me to tell Leon that Thomas Yu, with whom he had been at military school, was looking for him. The hero smiled, saying that upon hearing this, Leon would immediately remember him. The National Committee is a body responsible for governing the country and its restoration. Now, this institution was both the administrative and military center of Korea. Key positions here are occupied by graduates of the former Hunters Academy, one of whom is the managing committee, former hunter Leon Neal. Thomas was sure that his former comrade would not want to see him, and it was absolutely mutual. Suddenly, someone approached him. When the man stopped next to him, the hero asked what was the matter. He said that recently the battles were becoming more and more difficult and they lacked people, especially those with combat experience. Thomas understood what he was getting at and refused, saying that he had already been suspended from service. He understood that given the kind of war they were currently waging, the number of soldiers was much more important than their quality, and they had stopped recruiting just anyone. Now they were looking for courageous, promising soldiers. But Thomas will never sign up for this, because he is not at all attracted by the prospect of dying on the front lines. Adjusting his glasses, the man confidently said that he had heard that Thomas was a hunter. The hero sighed loudly and covered his face with his hand, holding back his irritation. After standing like that for a few moments, he looked at the man again and asked who had sent him here, whether it was the case manager, but he replied that it was another person. When he heard the name called to him, he was surprised, because he had not expected to hear it at all. Thomas froze, digesting the information he had received. Afterwards, he asked in bewilderment whether Ksenia Reed was really on the National Committee. He was immediately flooded with memories of the times when he was still a military man. He and Ksenia served together, and he often told her not to think about other people's opinions, and that the end should justify any means. The girl had much less experience, so they took breaks from time to time so that she could recover, and during them, Thomas gave her various pieces of advice. And the girl persistently followed him, remembering everything that was told to her. Now he met her for the first time in many years. Taking a break from her reports, Ksenia greeted her old acquaintance. The first thing he noticed on her desk was a photo frame with her family photo. The girl decided to skip the formalities and get straight to the point, saying that they needed hunters. Thomas wearily said that he had to ask the classic question, "Why me?" But everything was perfectly clear here, in response to which he heard the remark that he was still trying hard to avoid military service. Without taking his eyes off her, he reminded her that they had once agreed that she would not work for the state. In response to this attack, Ksenia asked whether old promises meant anything in today's world. The hero knew the answer to this question perfectly well. He sighed and replied that that was exactly why he left, because he never wanted to do anything like that again. Ksenia interrupted him and said that the manager Leon Neal had already sent a request as well. What he heard did not please our hero at all. Noticing his expression, Ksenia said that he no longer held a grudge against Thomas. At least he was definitely not in a position to do so. She bit her lip in displeasure when the hero mockingly said that the world had changed as soon as Leon took the higher seat. Throwing a displeased glance at him, Ksenia said that he should be perfectly aware of the situation they were all in now and what was happening on the front lines every day. After her words, silence reigned in the office. Thomas was in no hurry to answer anything. He knew perfectly well what Ksenia was talking about. He didn't even have to imagine the horrible images because fragments of memories of everything he had witnessed floated into his head. That was the whole problem. He desperately didn't want to go back to that life. Ksenia noticed how his fists clenched in his pockets. Sighing, she looked down and apologized regretfully. Afterwards, she asked him if he knew anything about the P Corporation, and when he answered negatively, she told him that they would need help in hunting monsters, which is why they had turned to them, but they had nothing to help them with now. Ksenia placed her palm on the folder with the report and moved it a little further, after which she said that she wanted Thomas to put on a show there. Hearing her request, the hero was surprised. She assured him that as long as she lived, he would not find himself on the front lines. After looking at her for a few moments, the hero thanked her for it. The girl's gaze softened a little, and she said that everything had changed a lot here, of course. Everyone except Thomas. Many people have wondered what will happen to large industrial conglomerates after the end of the world, and not long ago, a drone discovered the bunker of one of them. It was a whole closed ecosystem which even had golf courses. Thomas understood that leaving the company and social status to which he had dedicated his life in order to protect himself and his family was a natural choice, one that most rich people made. But naturally, there were others among them who could not give up power in the changed world, and among them was the leader of the R Corporation. A month later, the corporation made an appointment with Thomas. Early in the morning, he arrived at the building of the new headquarters, which was designed by a British architect known throughout the world, but the construction was not destined to be completed due to the outbreak of war. So Thomas had to freeze in the construction elevator for quite a long time. Because he had to go up to the 55th floor, the cold was especially noticeable as the elevator approached the top floors. Entering inside, he stopped at the doors of the meeting room. Previously, only the best of the best, the pinnacle of the Korean elite, could enter there. As soon as Thomas walked inside and saw the people gathered there, he realized that nothing had really changed. He glanced at their faces, focusing on just one person. But he didn't even think to turn to face him. Thomas also noticed the workers' ID cards hanging around their necks, although he didn't see any point in them, since there was no electricity. A man approached him from the side with a smile on his face and said that he had heard about the hero. Thomas turned to him and greeted him with his hands outstretched, but the man ignored it and stared at the piece of paper, asking what his rank was. Our hero did not expect that they would start asking him questions right away and answered that he had a D rank. After marking something, the man asked if he had combat experience and in what countries he served. Thomas replied that he had made a couple of small trips to Korea, but had never been a captain, and as for the rifts, he had very little idea what was going on there. Having written everything down, the man said that they would finish here and asked to wait here for a bit. Thomas answered the first thing that came to his mind, so as not to end up somewhere at the front. He knew that most of the records were lost. He was sure that Ksenia had already prepared everything in advance, and that he only needed to pass the minimum threshold to get to the place prepared for him. While thinking about this, the hero did not notice how someone approached him again. The voice of a girl who stopped next to him brought him out of his thoughts. She asked if it was true that he was a hunter. Thomas was a little surprised by her question and was in no hurry to answer it. Without waiting for his answer, Olivia pressed her back against the wall and told him that a whole horde of zombies had appeared in the industrial complex that worked for the P Corporation. Since most of the people defending the complex died, they had to turn to the National Committee for help. Olivia herself considered it complete nonsense that now, when everything was going to hell, people continued to sacrifice themselves for the sake of the company. There was a look of doom on her face. Nodding towards the men seated at the long table, she said that they were just a bunch of crazy people who believed that in a fallen world, something could still be achieved through loyalty to the company. Thomas understood and shared her thoughts, because he himself often asked himself similar questions. Suddenly, Olivia grabbed his hand, handing him a business card, and said with hope in her voice that her father was still in the complex, like many others. Thomas looked down at the business card pressed into his palm, reading the name. When the girl said that her father's name was Cedric Milton and that he was a representative of the subcontractor company to which the team would be sent, the hero's eyes widened slightly in surprise. Olivia hesitated slightly, promising that one day she would repay him in full, but he had to fulfill one request. She desperately asked to save her father. At that moment, Thomas was called out. All the men sitting at the table stood up and headed for the exit. The man conducting the survey called the hero to come with them. When Thomas asked where they were going, he was told that he would find out everything on the spot. This answer made our hero a little nervous. He sighed and took a step forward. But before going further, he turned to Olivia and said that he could not promise anything. After all, hunters are not gods at all, and ordinary people will never understand this. The Korean economy is designed in such a way that without waterways, it would collapse. Although some companies are still managing to hold on, the outcome has long been predetermined, and P Corporation was no exception. When Thomas was brought to the corporation's plant, he was amazed by the weapons located there. He understood that this could only be achieved when the leaders seriously tried to assemble a personal army. A man approached their group and said that they had arrived just in time. Afterwards, he introduced himself as Peter and said that he was currently serving in the National Committee and was a former hunter, and that he would also be a consultant on the upcoming mission. Having said this, he bowed, saying that it was a new meeting. Thomas was surprised that Peter was so young and already a member of the National Committee. He had previously heard that people who were hunters in the past are now treated with special respect. Sometime later, they moved into the conference room to discuss the plan of action. Peter was confident that they should immediately use all the resources available to them. Some did not share his opinion, saying that there were thousands of zombies in the complex alone, and that the operation had already been postponed for a whole month on his advice. Thomas stood to the side in no hurry to intervene in the discussion. Peter held up his index finger, saying that this was exactly the point, because zombies had a limited lifespan and needed to eat something, and in these conditions they wouldn't last more than a month. He was sure that at this point the bulk of the zombies had either already died or were on the verge of dying, and the necromancers themselves, without the support of the zombies, did not pose much of a threat, and they would be able to simply crush them with armored vehicles. Many were unsure if it would actually work, but his confident tone endeared him to everyone, and the men decided to trust him. All this time, besides Thomas, there was one other person who said nothing, the chairman of the R Corporation, Hopper Nat. When Peter asked him what he thought about it, he slowly turned his gaze to the former hunter, after which he said that if the issue could be resolved quickly, he saw no reason to act differently. The hero did not take his eyes off Peter, assessing him. Handsome face, confident voice, and he told in detail about the zombies, offering a well-thought-out strategy. If he didn't have many years of experience behind him, even he would be ready to believe everything said here, let alone the old men gathered here. Peter smiled smugly, happy that everything was going well. Suddenly he remembered something. Turning his gaze to Thomas, he asked him what he thought of their plan. For a few seconds, the hero considered what he should do. Peter's face was full of smiles. He knew that Thomas had been sent here by the National Committee as a hunter, and he was eager to prove his superiority to everyone. Sighing, the hero said that, in his opinion, this was all a big mistake. Peter did not expect such an answer and asked in bewilderment what it meant. Thomas explained that zombies do not die of hunger but simply go into suspended animation. This means that they hardly move, their metabolism practically stops, but if they never find food, then in this case, they actually die. Because fresh human meat is constantly supplied to the complex, the zombies will not die. So he proposed to develop a new strategy. The hero wouldn't care if this wrong strategy buried them all, but if it suddenly became his responsibility, then there would be problems, so he had to intervene. He also expressed his disapproval of the use of armored vehicles. He explained that zombies have exceptionally good hearing and sense of smell. Therefore, if they use technology, zombies from all around will come running to them, and in general, Thomas did not understand why they would deploy all their combat resources at once. Unable to bear it any longer, Peter muttered through his teeth that he'd better stop. In response, the hero said that the outcome of a battle is 90% planning. If the plan is bad from the start, then there can be no talk of any success. After these words, Peter lost his self-control and wanted to rush at him, asking in bewilderment who Thomas was to behave so unceremoniously with a committee member, but he was stopped, held in place. The hero ignored his attack, turning away in the other direction. He didn't need approval from such people at all. He was not addressing them at all, but those whose word carried weight. The chairman and the representative of the allied company standing next to him. The latter was the father of the girl who asked Thomas for help. The hero slowly moved towards them, not taking his eyes off the man. Stopping next to him, he put his hand on his shoulder, after which he quietly said that his daughter asked for help, and when he gave the signal, the man should run. As a result of the discussion, Peter finally convinced the management to go along with his crazy plan, and now they were surrounded by a countless crowd of zombies. Machine guns were not scary to them because they somehow managed to break through even them, which made the situation even worse. Peter yelled into the radio for everyone to get their flamethrowers out and fire them. As soon as he gave this order, the connection with 2 tanks was broken. He began to scream even louder, completely not understanding what was happening there. A huge shadow looming over him made the man raise his head and freeze in shock. Something unimaginable was happening before his eyes. A huge necromancer appeared from a huge portal that appeared out of nowhere. He slowly opened his stiff limbs, spreading them out to the sides. Standing behind the representative, Thomas said that it was time for them to get out of here. The man looked at him in bewilderment, and he explained that they were powerless in the current situation. A couple of minutes later, everything within a radius of the nearest kilometers was engulfed in a bright flash of light. Upon returning to headquarters, Ksenia thanked him for his help and expressed her hope that after such a failure, the chairman would at least moderate his ambitions a little. Speaking about him, the girl remembered that the chairman wanted to talk to Thomas one-on-one, which she told him about. The hero was not surprised by this because he suspected that something like this was about to happen. As he headed to the meeting place, he was well aware that they were now actively looking for a replacement for the deceased Peter, so Thomas did not see any reason to go to the meeting, but he was too overcome with curiosity. Entering the building, he looked carefully at the door numbers to determine the one he needed. He stopped for a few moments at one of them and slowly opened the door. Hopper Nat was already waiting for him there. When Thomas sat down at the table, the man said that he had dug a little into his past and was pleasantly surprised, because you don't often meet such people. The hero indifferently replied that all the past remained in the past. Hopper ignored this and said that from what he heard, Leon Neal was no match for him, and now he was almost a legend. He also knew that Thomas was on the same team with two legendary saviors of their time. When the man said that he was ready to provide him with everything he needed if Thomas returned to service, the hero sighed tiredly, looking down. Putting the knife aside, he replied that he could only wish Hopper good luck in the future. Immediately after that, he rose from his seat. At the same moment, Hopper seriously said that he was going to fight for that complex again. Hearing this, Thomas froze and turned his gaze to the man. He continued by saying that he was an illegitimate child and initially had no chance to inherit the company, but he went against the odds. So now, when all the time everyone believes that the world can no longer be saved, he is going to go against all odds again, and this time not for himself, and he does not intend to give up. He asked Thomas to at least help them come up with a plan to defeat these monsters. After listening to him, the hero had the thought that too often hopeless fools find themselves at the helm. But that was the whole point of entrepreneurs. Thomas sighed and said he would give one hint. Several more days passed after their meeting, and all this time he closely followed the news to find out how everything turned out in the end. That's why the sound of the notification from the forum immediately attracted the hero's attention. The article about the fall of P Corporation included a photo of the army. Thomas looked more closely at the photo and was very surprised. Nowadays, all the heads abandoned their workers to hide behind high and safe walls. But one entrepreneur was an exception to this rule. Even though Hopper Nut turned into a zombie, he continued to work. He confidently led his men until the very end. While walking along one of the streets, the hero noticed an old woman feeding homeless cats. Thomas looked at her with displeasure, knowing full well what this could all lead to. Stopping, he called out to her and said that he would not advise her to feed stray animals because it could be too dangerous. The woman looked up at him but said nothing. Then she turned back, and she also silently took her cart and walked away. Thomas remained standing, looking at her back and thinking that most dangerous situations occur due to human error, but human errors can be easily prevented. This case with the cat lady was, in a way, one of those. Over the course of a couple of weeks, he encountered her again, and with significantly larger cats. Although it is hard to believe now, when the Chinese government was still in power, South Korea sent out a hunting party. They were supposed to contain the monsters emerging from China. The monsters themselves appeared from the rifts. The very first portals appeared in India. The country fell instantly, and soon the neighboring countries followed suit. Then the monsters moved from India to Southeast Asia and from there to China. Korea was next in line. During one of his missions in China, Thomas managed to catch a huge rat. Thanks to this, scientists have discovered strange mutations that occur in animals near the faults. And today our hero came across this woman with cats again, and once again warned that sooner or later they would eat her. But the woman kept turning away, saying that she didn't care and Thomas shouldn't either. They had this conversation every time he went out to look for resources, Thomas sighed, deciding that there was simply no point in trying to warn her any further, because every person should have their own head on their shoulders. So he returned to his normal life in the bunker, making toys from time to time. His skills had improved significantly, but he was clearly still far from perfect. Suddenly a signal came from the radio. Thomas put the doll aside and picked up the walkie-talkie. As soon as he heard that Ksenia was on the line, his face twisted in displeasure. Reluctantly, he asked what was the matter, and she apologized and said that she had one more request for him. Thomas, with a lot of discontent in his voice, reminded her that they had only agreed on one task. The girl replied that the situation was very urgent, and this would indeed be the last task. When Ksenia mentioned that this task also concerns him, because he lives near the BBC base, and next to it is a residential complex in which mutants have appeared, the hero immediately understood what they were talking about. The girl spoke in more detail about how stray cats have mutated and started attacking residents. They don't even know the exact number of victims, and the survivors are afraid to go outside. Thomas sighed and replied that he no longer hunted. He had neither the skills nor the equipment nor any desire to take it up. Then Ksenia replied that she would send an expert to help him. The hero asked in bewilderment who they were talking about, to which the girl replied that it was a freelance hunter. A few hours later, Sam arrived at the designated location on a motorcycle. He got off him and took a few steps towards Thomas, holding out his hand, after which he introduced himself with a friendly smile. The hero did not give his name, but simply said that he was a former hunter and would help if needed. But Sam recognized our hero without his name being spoken, asking if he was the same Thomas Ho from the legendary 13th grade. Seeing the confusion on his colleague's face, he explained that he had studied at the same school, but in the 12th grade. He later admitted that he expected to see someone like himself here, a mediocre guy looking for a hack job. But he certainly didn't expect to see one of the outstanding students of the most legendary class. The more Sam spoke, delving into the past, the more gloomy and dangerous Thomas's gaze became. Looking away from Sam, the hero said that he would prefer to avoid this topic as much as possible. Soon they reached the residential complex in complete silence. Thomas stopped, noticing bloodstains everywhere, asking what it was. Sam gave a mirthless smile and replied that that was exactly what he thought. After he got off his motorcycle and told that on the way here he managed to look around the surroundings, the mutants attacked him almost instantly, because they already know the taste of human flesh too well. But even so, the cats remained just cats, and it only took him a couple of shots to make them scatter. Thomas had been watching Sam closely all this time, and he noticed that since he was hunting mutants alone, he had a lot of guts, and even a simpleton wouldn't be able to do something like that. If Sam were on his team, he would rate him as A rank, no less. Meanwhile, the hunter continued to talk about his encounter with the mutants. He said that there was no particular difficulty with them. He easily cornered them and was going to finish them off with explosives. But he was suddenly interrupted. The woman grabbed his hand with the explosives, preventing him from carrying out his plan. So they will have to look for where these mutants are hiding. Thomas looked away, knowing full well who was being talked about. He told him about his suspicions and proposed a plan. A couple of hours later, as the day was drawing to a close, a woman Thomas knew went out to look for her cats. Our heroes hid in the shadows, not giving away their presence ahead of time. Our hero's guess turned out to be correct because all this time he met only one woman who fed cats. Therefore, he was confident that they would respond to her call. A couple of minutes later, quiet approaching footsteps were heard. 3 mutant cats came out to meet their owner. At that moment, Thomas noticed the signal given by Sam. Stepping forward a little, he nodded, indicating that he understood everything. Grabbing his weapon, he stepped out from behind cover. Sam did the same, slowly approaching the cats. Thomas turned his sights to one of the cats closest to him, after which he opened fire. He managed to shoot one of the cats, the others dodged. The woman who raised these cats could not calmly watch such a horrific scene. One of the cats jumped furiously at Thomas, growling loudly, but the hero did not stop shooting, remaining in place. When the cat swung its paw, trying to catch him with its claws, the hero dodged. Dropping to his knees, he began shooting at vital organs and paws. And then a few moments later, the mutant fell to the ground and Thomas stopped shooting. The woman screamed with anger and horror in her voice for them not to touch her little angels. When Thomas was about to open fire again to finish off the last cat, Sam stopped him. Stopping next to him, he threw explosives at the cat. Seeing this, the woman ran forward, covering the last cat with her body. As the explosives began to glow, ready to explode, fear and pain were reflected in her eyes. Memories of the past instantly flashed through her mind. When the end of the world came, she found herself in a hopeless situation, and people refused to help her, so a cat came to her instead. His 2 friends immediately ran up to them and studied the woman with cautious glances. As the cats headed off in an unknown direction, she hesitantly followed them. They brought her to an old, empty house. Since then, they lived together, taking care of each other. And together they will meet their end. The bomb went off and there was a loud explosion, engulfing the unfortunate victims. Thomas looked at his partner with a hint of condemnation in his voice and said that Sam would stop at nothing to achieve his goal. He only smiled sadly, saying that in today's world one must clearly distinguish between one's desires and reality. Having said this, he moved away, leaving Thomas alone. The hero believed that the company's collapse was somewhat similar to a plane crash. After all, even without a driving force, the object still flies by inertia. And at one moment, he suddenly falls with a crash, crashing to the ground, a phenomenon he had observed very often in his life. The plane flying above him had prompted him to think about this. Thomas had assumed what might be going on in the heads of the government members, but such a time had come much earlier than he had expected. Returning to the bunker, he prepared himself lunch. Thomas reflected on the fact that people are designed in such a way that they cannot live without entertainment, and in fact there is nothing wrong with this, because it gives phantom feelings of meaning and in some way is a cure for fatigue. Our hero also had a similar source of entertainment, namely the Long Live the Apocalypse forum. This forum has long since lost its original meaning. The main reason for this was the fact that it was too late to prepare for the coming end of the world, and the event itself was long gone. In a world where everyone lives in constant solitude, Long Live the Apocalypse became a society where people simply talked about their lives and looked for some peace. Due to lack of other activities, Thomas devoted all his time to this forum. Now it is no different from the forums that existed in the past. Here you can write posts, comments, and messages, as well as rate other people's posts. Posts that receive a large number of positive ratings are placed in a separate section called Best on the forum now. And recently our hero also managed to get into this section. He wrote a post about his meeting with the chairman, carefully but discreetly, and this post attracted a lot of attention from users. Around the same time, someone posted a piece of news that caused quite a stir throughout society. This news concerned the Lottery of Hope, recently introduced by the National Committee. Tickets were distributed to everyone who wanted them, just like rations. Participants line up and draw tickets every 3 days in a designated area. This game brightened up the gray everyday life of the residents and brought something into it other than hard work. For places from 2nd to 5th, they gave out additional rations or some basic necessities, and the prize for first place was a voucher for accommodation. These people were to be allocated places in a residential complex capable of providing their own food and electricity. It was securely protected and so packed in technical captivity that it resembled the secret shelters of conglomerates, and active discussions on this topic immediately flared up on the forum. While people were dreaming more and more, the first winner appeared. His nickname was 9M. Our hero almost immediately remembered that he had already met this man a couple of times. He also went to John Nennon's meetings. He never took part in the discussions, mostly quietly grilling meat. The community reacted very strongly to his post, with a huge number of comments filled with admiration and envy. The fortune that smiled upon him completely blinded him, and his behavior changed greatly. At every opportunity, he bragged about the chance he had been given. Over time, his bragging turned into crude ridicule and humiliation of other members of society. The situation on the forum was heating up to the limit. The response from other users who had lost patience was not long in coming. Thomas watched the situation from the sidelines, and he didn't really believe in the reality of this prize, because even basic maintenance was entirely dependent on brute labor. Hence the question of where the National Committee would get the funds for such a complex. Therefore, he decided to contact Xenia to find out everything for sure. It all seemed too strange to him. She answered almost immediately, and Thomas asked if there was any chance that the Nadezhda residential complex would actually be built. The girl went out onto the balcony and lit a cigarette before answering him. Exhaling cigarette smoke, she said that in essence, hope is just a mirage. Afterwards, she informed Thomas that they were planning to move to Jeju and that they had to sort everything out by next spring. It became obvious to almost everyone that Seoul had no chance of being saved. She warned him that this was classified information and he should not spread it around. After this conversation, Thomas became lost in thought. Although he was not in the capital itself, he had a strange feeling that the government had decided to abandon Seoul. His life in the bunker had its downsides. He was a hero. He didn't know whether it was day or night, monotonous food and the same experiences, but just the knowledge that Seoul was nearby helped him cope with it. He remembered that Xenia asked him not to spread the word, so he decided to keep it all a secret. But when he looked at other people's posts, full of joy from winning first place in the lottery, doubt began to arise in his soul. Thomas understood that hope and faith in the restoration of the country were just empty dreams. At the same time, he was tempted by the thought that if he wrote about this, he would become famous. However, Thomas was known for his saintly patience, so people were not destined to learn about the cruel reality. A couple of days later, he got out into the city. He took a growing kit with him. Having met the right person, he exchanged him. Thomas found a way to grow what smokers value most, and in the post-apocalyptic conditions, it was a very popular currency. While the man was checking the kit, people standing in a long line looked at them with displeasure. Suddenly, loud screams were heard from the distance. A group of 3 men walked through the crowd with smug smiles and mockingly asked since when people started lining up in the foolish hope of hitting the jackpot. A woman standing in line responded with displeasure that they literally lived on the same food as everyone else. Thomas asked his client who these guys were, and he replied that they were potential residents of Nadezhda, and that they began to gather in groups and act as if they were better than everyone else. Hearing this, the hero frowned slightly in displeasure. At the same moment, it was announced that the food distribution was over for today, which caused strong discontent, and then the woman announced that the committee had reduced the quota for each region. But her words did not inspire confidence because there was still a lot of food visible in the truck. So when the doors of the truck slammed shut, people rushed towards the truck to take their food by force. But the truck immediately moved off, leaving the crowd of angry people behind. The other part of those who stood in line for food remained standing in place, watching everything with horror and doom. Thomas watched everything from the sidelines without interfering. A group of people who won the lottery were happily discussing how, since food was becoming scarcer, prices would rise, which meant that their apartments would become much more expensive. Thomas found it extremely unpleasant to listen to their conversations. He immediately remembered their conversation with Ksenia. The hero himself did not know what was better, a life without hope or a life in which there was only one hope, albeit illusory. When Thomas left his statement and announced his resignation, Milton jumped up from his seat, shouting at the departing guy. He slammed his fist on the table, saying that he understood how difficult it had been for him all this time, but they were all in too difficult a situation now. Milton bowed his head and asked if Thomas had thought about those whose trust he was betraying by acting in such a way. He suggested that the hero just take a break for a while, and he would come up with something with his service record. There shouldn't be any problems with his superiors, because all he had to do was hold out for a little while and then it would finally end. Thomas turned to him and asked irritably if Milton himself believed what he was saying, and that the situation would really change if he stayed. When Thomas said that things were much worse because he was still here, his subordinates weren't leaving, couldn't escape this hell on their own, Milton just pursed his lips. The hero continued, immersed in memories of the day when he only miraculously managed to survive. He said that from that very day on, any soldier who has been on the battlefield understands how everything will end in the end. So Thomas demanded that Milton not even think about interfering with him. He just sighed, realizing his powerlessness in this situation, and said that it was pouring rain outside, so the hero should take an umbrella with him. Thomas looked at Milton in silence for a few moments, after which he turned around and walked on, telling him to try not to die. Since then, Thomas left his comrades and lives in a bunker, and his opinion still has not changed. He was sure that people would die out and this could not be avoided. His ultimate feeling that there was no more hope never went away. Therefore, all his efforts are just selfless attempts to live another day. Suddenly, a message appeared on the forum that an earthquake had begun in the P area. The hero knew that the first fault in Korea had opened in this very place. A local earthquake somewhere near the fault could very likely mean the appearance of an especially large specimen of the monster. Having closed the laptop, the hero took his bicycle. Thomas was sure that in connection with what was happening, the National Committee would now be in complete chaos. He knew perfectly well that the destructive power of large individuals was akin to a full-fledged natural disaster, and it was simply useless to fight it. Their only weakness was the earthly environment. Large individuals began to rot and disintegrate as soon as they left the rift. When the hero pressed the button, the door to the bunker began to slowly open, letting bright light inside. Because of such a strong contrast, the hero covered his eyes with his hand. Stepping outside, he looked up at the clear blue, cloudless sky, letting the warm rays of the sun shine upon him. Having got on his bicycle, he soon arrived in Seoul, where the headquarters of the National Committee was located. Meanwhile, there was a real commotion there, continuous phone calls and running around. Looking at all this, the hero noted that everything was even worse than he had imagined. Suddenly, a man bumped into him and dropped the papers he was carrying with information about the monsters. Apologizing, he immediately sat down on the floor and began to collect everything. Thomas helped the man by handing over some of the fallen sheets. Having thanked him, he quickly left. The hero remained standing in place, watching his back. In one of the sheets, he saw that among the monsters that had appeared was the Kraken, whose route they were now trying to calculate. And he didn't like it very much, because he realized how much worse things could get. Krakens were the most common type of large individual, usually resembling huge octopuses. But as soon as they detect a threat, they immediately change their form. Their main danger lies in the death ray they release when in combat mode. Humanity has been unable to come up with a defense against such an attack. So the chances of salvation or survival when faced with this beam are zero. It breaks through everything in its path, destroying all living organisms in its path. Thomas managed to read that a similar Kraken had recently appeared in Tokyo and disintegrated in Nagano Prefecture, but not before killing about 50,000 people. Having calculated the expected route of the newly appeared Kraken, he realized that the monster would pass very close to him, and if he had not accidentally come across those papers, he could have died. Suddenly, Thomas noticed Ksenia on the top floor, accompanied by two colleagues. The girl also noticed him and stopped slightly. For a few moments, they simply exchanged glances. Thomas understood that although he had not originally intended to leave his shelter, the situation forced him to change his plans. Ksenia also advised him not to delay and evacuate. Having said this, she turned around and entered one of the offices. Thomas watched as the door slammed shut. Returning back to the bunker, he immediately began to collect all the items he needed immediately. From time to time, he glanced towards the laptop. The thought of writing a post with a warning flashed through his mind, but he was unsure whether he should do it. Suddenly, Thomas remembered Ksenia's warning, which helped him make his decision. Sitting down at his laptop, he nevertheless wrote a warning for other users. But when I saw that his post only got 2 views, I realized that there was no chance. He sighed and stretched, deciding that he had done everything he could and now it was time for him to get out of here. At that moment, a hissing sound came from the radio. Michelle contacted him and asked how he was doing. Thomas decided to ignore this question and asked if they had a jeep and asked Alexa to come get it. Now they all needed to evacuate urgently. When the girl replied that their car had broken down, the hero froze in surprise. Alexa explained that the engine had died and the car wouldn't start. Michelle asked how serious it was and if they could just hide in the building. The hero frowned, thinking about the situation. The building they were in was further north, and the Kraken was moving right in that direction. Although it was painful for him to realize this, he understood that there was no time to save them, because these were not just marauders, but something much more serious and dangerous. Mentally apologizing to them, Thomas replied that they should hurry and try to get as far south as possible. Michelle thanked him for the warning, and when he was about to hang up, she said that there would be a heavy downpour tomorrow and warned him to take an umbrella. Hearing this phrase, the hero froze. He understood only too well that in a world that had already come to an end, exercise was an unaffordable luxury, something he constantly reminded himself of. But the words Michelle spoke were exactly like those his partner had spoken on the last day of their meeting, and they were the ones that shook the feelings he had so carefully suppressed. Thomas slammed the box of supplies he had collected onto the table. Afterwards, he told Michelle that he would be with them in half an hour, during which time they should have time to get ready. Having given the final instructions, the hero walked quickly to the other end of the room. Stopping at one of the cabinets, he stopped, opening its doors. Thomas knew that the area between his hideout and the girls had recently become infested with wild mutant dogs, and the path to them promises to be very dangerous unless you take a detour. But now time was not on his side. He sighed and reached into the closet. From there, he took out one of the pistols and loaded it. The only available way out in this situation for our hero was to break through by force. Soon, having got into the car he had found earlier, he left the base and headed towards Michelle and Alexa, and almost immediately a pack of mutant dogs followed him. Taking one hand off the wheel, he aimed his weapon at the monsters. They were not at all afraid of the weapon and, without slowing down, continued to rush after him. Thomas pulled the trigger and fired. He managed to hit one of them on the first try, and it immediately fell to the ground, while the other dogs continued chasing it. Thomas took aim again at the approaching enemy. His second hit also hit the target. Looking around, he quickly reloaded his pistol. Then the shelling began again. The monsters' heads flew off one after another. Thomas frowned in displeasure when he missed once due to the violent shaking of the transport. Typically, in a hunting party, soldiers are divided into three categories. The first are the riflemen, support, operating heavy weapons from the rear. The second are signalmen, who have a supporting role. They helped and acted as intermediaries between the rear and the front. And the last category are those who fight under the cover of shooters. Coupled with the tactical and strategic support of signalmen, they boldly rushed straight at the enemy. This type of warriors was called the vanguard. It was to him that our hero belonged in the past. So now he had a pretty difficult time. The only way to successfully combine the two roles was to think fast and shoot even faster. It was his job to maintain his speed while shooting back at the mutants trying to devour him. Both actions were incredibly important. A few minutes later, Thomas finally managed to enter the area where Alexa and her daughter lived. At that very moment, he noticed an unusually large white mutant on the roof of one of the houses. Our hero was very surprised when he saw him. This dog was so different from the others that it crossed Thomas's mind that he might be the leader of the pack. The mutant watched him carefully. Suddenly, he threw his head back and let out a loud howl. At that very moment, several more dogs surrounded him. Thomas was forced to open fire again, getting rid of the threat in their face. The shot monster immediately flew to the side. The hero pressed harder on the gas pedal, trying to understand where so many of them had come from. Also noticing how the leader was pursuing him, observing the situation from the side, Thomas assumed that he was probably up to something. He held the gun out in front of him and took aim, hoping that he would be able to hit from such a great distance. At that very moment, one of the dogs approached the car from the other side. He stopped the hero from shooting by hitting the car with his body. Due to the uneven roads and this impact, the hero lost control of the car. The car began to drift violently in different directions, trying to regain control. Thomas cursed, realizing that the situation could not be worse. Suddenly, he noticed that the leader had stopped at one of the buildings, as if waiting for something. Then the hero assumed that they were trying to drive him like a victim. Meanwhile, the monsters were increasingly surrounding him. One of the dogs even managed to jump onto the roof of the car. Opening his mouth, the leader of the pack let out another long howl. Thomas's eyes widened in shock as he realized that the leader was giving orders to his pack in this manner. Immediately after this, the mutant dogs began to attack even more furiously, but they could not stand up to the pistol. Letting go of the wheel, the hero reached for another pistol, thinking about how the leader of the pack controlled which way he would turn at every fork in the road. With a couple more shots, he got rid of the dogs that surrounded him. Then he grabbed the steering wheel and accelerated even faster. Thomas understood that they were trying to drive him into a dead end, and there was no way he could allow this to happen. Having waited for the right moment, he turned the steering wheel to the left. Thus, he successfully turned onto another street, and the monsters following him crashed into a building, not fitting into the turn. Although Thomas was able to somehow get out of the trap, the body of his car was badly damaged, and it was dangerous to continue driving like this, because the car would definitely not survive a couple more hits. As he moved forward, he wondered what he should do. Suddenly, he noticed the rapidly approaching leader of the pack in the side mirror and cursed. He was running out of bullets. Given the poor condition of the car, Thomas's only option was to get as far away as possible before the dogs attacked him again. While he was thinking about this, he didn't notice how one of the dogs got dangerously close to him, jumping from the roof. His eyes widened in horror when he noticed it. It was too late. A second before the worst could happen, someone shot the animal and it fell to the ground, falling from the car. Thomas froze, looking at the tall building nearby. Alexa said over the radio that she would cover him. Thomas had already managed to forget that he was in the sniper's field of vision. Having a strong ally gave him confidence and helped him relax a little. Getting out of the car with an axe in his hand, he told the American that they should try to deal with everything in 3 minutes. Immediately after this, he boldly rushed at the mutants. Thomas swung his axe over and over, cutting off the necks of his enemies. Alexa actively helped him with this. All her shots were extremely accurate and fast. Thanks to their joint work, the ranks of monsters thinned out significantly quickly. The leader stood aside all this time without interfering. A few moments later, it was finally all over. The hero turned towards the leader, expecting some action from him. Instead of attacking, he chose to run away, fully aware of the hopelessness of the situation. Soon, Alexa and a joyful Michelle came down to Thomas. The girl immediately ran up to him and hugged him tightly. The hero hugged her back with his free hand. Afterwards, he quietly said that they had little time and they had to get away from here as quickly as possible. Thus, the three of them left the area as the sun began to slowly rise above the horizon, marking the beginning of a new day. Sleeping on Alexa's lap, Michelle woke up. Surprise showed in her eyes as she looked around. The sky was illuminated by a bright light, and golden scales rose into the sky. The girl was amazed by such captivating beauty and drew the adults' attention to it. The hero stopped, and they, along with the equally shocked Alex, got out of the car. Thomas sighed with relief when he realized that the Kraken's remains had finally begun to disintegrate from the sun somewhere far away from here. Suddenly, an idea struck him when he saw the mother and daughter, and he asked them to freeze for a few moments, explaining that he wanted to take a photo as a memory of this beautiful sunrise. While our hero was taking a memorable photo, at that moment there was another person next to them who had a similar idea. The girl standing a little further away from the man asked with displeasure how much longer he could admire himself. He, looking at Thomas captured in the photo, replied that this time it was not him in the photo, but something much more interesting. The stranger kept his eyes on the photo, smiling happily. Unsuspectingly, Thomas was taking photos of the girls the whole time. He understood that in such troubled times, everyone needed good memories. Returning to the bunker, Thomas immediately wrote a post. Under his post quite quickly. In the photo he posted, he blurred out Michelle and Alex's eyes to protect their privacy. In addition to the many views, someone even left a few comments under his post. Suddenly, something else caught his attention. Defender's post confirming the kill has once again made it to the top, for reasons unknown to our hero. Thomas clicked on the link, wondering who had been killed this time. He expected to see anything there, but not a photo of the sunrise with a caption that this time it was not a person, but a kraken-like monster. But the hero was surprised not so much by the content of the post, but by the photo attached to it. He instantly recalled his post with the photo to verify his fears. The hero was sure that the angle and time when the photos were taken matched, and this meant that they were in the same place with that same hunter. Suddenly, he received a notification that Defender had sent him a private message. After a slight hesitation, Thomas switched to the chat. There, he saw his own photo sent to him, which completely confirmed his recent guess. Just below, Defender asked if he guessed correctly, and it was really Thomas. This question caught our hero by surprise. Remembering Hunter's previous posts, he realized that he had previously hinted that he lived near the K area. So the fact that their paths crossed during the evacuation was a simple coincidence. Thomas decided that it was best for him to deny everything for now. When he wrote a message that it wasn't him, the girl sitting at the laptop on the other side smirked and replied that there was no point in denying everything. Thanks to his warning, he managed to survive and offered the hero to be friends. Remembering those two views under his last post, Thomas realized that the one who viewed it was Defender. At that very moment, the radio standing nearby began to hiss. After accepting the challenge, he asked Alexa what happened. She warned that a large group of people was moving in his direction, so she said he should be careful. Hearing this, Thomas sighed and thoughtfully rubbed his forehead. He understood perfectly well that such troubles were quite predictable. The leader of the pack that had settled near him to some extent protected the hero from such incidents. But after the last time, the pack has noticeably thinned out and weakened greatly, so now they can no longer prevent the refugees from moving towards his bunker. A couple of hours later, the refugees reached a spacious area where they decided to settle. Since they were located on Thomas's territory, he could see them perfectly well from the cameras. And the main problem was not even the settlers, but where exactly they decided to stop, namely right under the exhaust vent of his generator. Thomas didn't like it very much, because that's where the heart is that makes his bunker work, the diesel generator. It takes up an entire underground floor and produces a huge amount of energy, as well as a lot of exhaust gases. It was quite obvious that a house with smoke coming from the chimney on the roof would give away someone's presence. And if the generator starts working and gases start emitting, the refugees will find out where the bunker is, and that will be the end of it. But if Thomas turns off the generator, this place will very quickly cease to be his home. As luck would have it, the weather is now quite warm and sunny, as expected at the beginning of summer. Without a refrigerator, the food in the refrigerator would thaw and spoil very quickly at this rate. And all the hero's well-thought-out plans for the future will be destroyed. After observing the crowd of refugees for a while, Thomas assessed the level of their weapons and came to the conclusion that they had not yet become raiders. Therefore, he needs to try to resolve the issue peacefully. Meanwhile, the head of the refugees, Victor, was giving instructions to the others on what and where would be best to place. Suddenly, Thomas appeared behind him with a rifle at the ready and loudly declared that this was his private property, after which he asked everyone to leave this place. Victor turned to him, carefully examining and noting the weapon in his hands. When someone behind him shouted that whose land it was no longer mattered, he raised his hand, gesturing for no one to say anything. Afterwards, he himself stepped forward and said that Thomas could not worry about this, because they were from the team of pioneers. But upon hearing this, the hero frowned even more. To confirm his words, Victor took out the pioneer's license and showed it to the hero. Seeing her, the hero remembered an article he had recently seen on a forum about how the government had sent most of the unnecessary people to the suburbs as part of a pioneer squad, mostly old people. As soon as it was no longer possible to place the population in the cities, people were forced to go to more remote parts under the pretext of re-exploration, but they were not yet raiders. With this in mind, Thomas said that he was giving them 3 days to pack their things and leave this place. Hearing this, Victor was perplexed and wanted to rush at the guy, shouting that they were people authorized by the state and he had no right to drive them away from here, but others stopped him, blocking his path. Thomas grabbed the rifle with both hands and lifted it slightly. Afterwards, he said that they came here precisely because this state no longer exists. Contrary to our hero's expectations, after 3 days and even at the beginning of the next, there was not even a single hint of their departure. Then Thomas visited them again, and after talking to Victor, he learned that they could not go anywhere without orders from headquarters. The man explained to him that if they left the assigned territory, their families would no longer receive rations, so they desperately asked him to tolerate Thomas for just a couple of weeks until they could figure out a way out of the situation. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by Olga, who appeared and implored the hero to show mercy to them. Bowing low, she took his hand in hers and said that they were all unfortunate souls here, abandoned by their families because of their age and rejected by the state, so she asked him to consider them his neighbors, living out their days. Thomas felt the woman put something in his hand. He opened his palm and looked at the cereal bar in surprise. That day, he left without answering anything. All these days, it was very dark in his bunker due to the lack of electricity. But this was a small thing compared to the constant heat and dampness. The hero, enduring all these inconveniences, was increasingly visited by the thought that it would be much easier to simply kill all these old people, but he constantly remembered that they were not raiders, and he did not want to kill ordinary residents. Wondering if he had any other options, he looked towards his laptop with the forum page open. Sitting down at the table, he wrote a post in which he described his situation and asked how best to proceed. Most of the people advised him to put a bullet in the heads of these refugees and end it all, but this option did not suit our hero at all. Suddenly, he received a message from Defender, who wrote that although not now, in the near future, these old men would become raiders, and when their supplies ran out, Thomas would be next in line, so he should act ahead of the game. The hero sighed heavily, thinking that from someone like him, no other advice could be expected. But in some ways, he agreed with him. Deciding not to act hastily, Thomas decided to wait a little longer and observe the situation. And soon he had a wonderful chance to get out of the situation without anyone's casualties. After agreeing to meet with Killian, who was one of the rare normal users of the community, they went to a place where he had recently found something interesting. After walking a little higher up the mountain, they stopped, and Killian pointed ahead of him, saying that it was here. Thomas saw a large white capsule near a tall tree. When Killian asked what it was, the hero replied that it was an extremely dangerous thing, namely the monster egg. Let's go back a couple of days ago when our hero accidentally stumbled upon Killian's sweat about some white thing appearing near his house. As soon as Thomas saw this post, he immediately had a crazy idea. Since the Pioneer Squad cannot leave without orders from the leadership, then we just need to find a reason to force them. So he immediately took action. He wrote in private messages that this thing is very dangerous and he can help get rid of it. Thanks to the community's activity, Killian had little doubt that his words were true, so once they agreed on a meeting place, Thomas immediately set off. He ignored the navigator's instructions, as it was already hopelessly outdated information that was of no use. Instead, in order to cross the urban area more quickly, he contacted the headquarters of the National Committee. His identity was quickly established, after which he was told to take Route 13, then Route 22, and then turn onto Route 8. Having thanked the employee, Thomas cut the connection, thinking that his visit to the National Committee had paid off, since they had provided him with a safe road controlled by the state. The location Killian gave him was in the P area. This is where the first fault appeared in South Korea. The capsule itself appeared on a remote mountain outside the city. When the hero arrived at the place, they were already waiting for him. Getting out of the car, Thomas approached the guy standing by the tree with a gun. Stopping next to him, he named his nickname from the forum. Killian responded with his own and smiled at him warmly. The hero decided to get straight to the point and asked where the capsule was. He wanted to hurry because he knew that the appearance of the capsule meant that the destruction of the surrounding area had already begun under the influence of the split. Very soon, this territory will become uninhabitable. When Killian heard that it was a monster egg, he was horrified and asked if it was too dangerous. Thomas replied that he had already spoken about this before and pulled out his axe from behind his back. After which, rolling up his sleeves, he moved towards the capsule. Turning around, he threw out to Killian one last time that if he died here, then he should take his car and get out of here, which terrified the guy even more. The hero himself hoped that it would not come to this. Gripping the axe tighter, he rushed forward. In a matter of moments, Thomas found himself near the capsule and raised his axe to strike. In all his actions and looks, one could read a fierce intention to get rid of the capsule. And then, when there were only a few centimeters left to his target, the blade of the axe froze in the air. With all his might, Thomas forced his axe to stop. The green matter that appeared near the capsule completely mirrored his movements. The illusory axe froze a centimeter from Thomas's neck. When the hero lowered his axe, which was pointed at his neck, also dissipated, Killian, with his gun aimed, asked in confusion what it was. Thomas answered that it was a reflective barrier. This barrier distorts dimensions, reflecting and redirecting any attack back at the attacker, and was also one of the few reasons why humans still cannot defeat monsters. The hero reassured Killian by saying that as long as the capsule did not feel threatened, they had nothing to worry about. But his words had the opposite effect, and he worriedly asked what would happen if something uncontrollable hatched from there. Thomas looked at him for a few seconds without answering, after which he said that in that case he would die. A couple of minutes later, they went down to the car and Thomas carefully loaded the capsule onto it. Watching him, Killian thoughtfully asked if he really was that same skeleton. As soon as they met, he imagined him to be completely different. When Thomas asked what he expected, Killian explained that on the forum he just seemed like a weird old man, always adding weird tags and engaging in low-level trolling. The hero got tired of hearing his own assessment, so he cut the guy off, saying that he still had a lot of things to do, and it was time for him to go. When he climbed back into the car, Killian thanked him for his help. In response, the hero said that if he was truly grateful, he should like all his posts. Killian agreed to his condition, smiling brightly. On the way back, Thomas reflected on the fact that since the apocalypse began, this was his first meeting with someone online in real life. The city was getting closer and closer. But the hero still could not forget this pleasant feeling, as if he had met his old friend or cousin, with whom he had been close in childhood. It was with these thoughts that he continued his journey home. On the nearest highway, a little further from his shelter, Thomas left the capsule. That same evening, a team of pioneers accidentally stumbled upon it. They had no idea what it could be. Victor picked up the radio and contacted headquarters, reporting that they had found an unknown object near their zone. When the authorities ordered them to leave immediately, the man's face showed confusion. On the other side of the radio, another man intercepted the radio and said that the image from the drone confirmed that it was a monster egg. He explained that it could be active, so they needed to evacuate from there as soon as possible. Victor wanted to object to him, but the man rudely interrupted him and shouted into the radio that they did not have time for this. If they did not want to die, they must immediately leave this place. Michael had been watching the cameras all this time in the underground level of his bunker, waiting for his plan to bear fruit, and as soon as it did, he immediately turned on the generator. A few moments later, the electricity returned and Thomas breathed a sigh of relief. Smoke from the vent outside poured into the air in a powerful stream. Thus, our hero's territory was successfully liberated. A month later, his life was back to normal. From that very day on, the detachment of pioneers never showed up again, which made Thomas very happy. The only irritating factor was Ksenia, who approached him from time to time with various requests. The hero assumed that they were preparing to leave for Jeju Island, and therefore were very busy. Killian, as promised, liked all his posts, and Defender also left various comments under his posts from time to time. While browsing the forum news, Thomas came across a strange article about the current situation in Seoul. Attached was a photo of an angry crowd protesting the relocation. The people demanded that the National Committee guarantee the safety of the people. Their cries even reached the office of the head of the National Committee, Leon Neal. Ksenia, standing behind him, asked the man to move away from the window, fearing that a stone might fly at him. Ignoring her warning, Leon lifted the curtain, peered outside, and asked if he was still alive. Ksenia didn't understand who they were talking about, so she decided to clarify. The man gave her a displeased look and explained that he was talking about Thomas, after which he ordered her to contact him and ask how long he planned to hide. The unsuspecting hero carefully studied the article on the forum. This article brought back memories of the times when the first one appeared. Then countries around the world expressed their concern about this. But at the same time, everyone without exception showed their hypocrisy. Politicians tried to use this anomaly to their advantage. Soon, a large expedition was sent to study the fault. They had to record everything with photographs. When the team was about to take a photo of their colleague near the fault, something happened that they did not expect. Noticing something horrific, the team rushed back, shouting to their comrade to get out of there immediately. But he didn't have time, and something blew off his head in an instant. The others also failed to escape. The monster that appeared took their lives too, tearing their bodies to pieces. After this incident, the appearance of monsters accelerated significantly, and humanity, caught off guard, suffered huge losses. Only then did everyone realize the seriousness of the situation. Therefore, in order to fight the monsters, they began training special military units, which were later called hunters. Thus, a special institute for training hunters was created, where our hero was part of the 13th class. At the end of each semester, the lists of midterm assessments of students were posted, the first 2 lines of which were annually decorated with the names of Thomas and Leon. Time and again, everyone was amazed at how Thomas was constantly able to take first place, and compared him to a killing machine that does nothing but train. Accustomed to such conversations behind his back, the hero no longer paid any attention to them. Among all the looks directed at him, only Leon's look was different. There was no envy or malice in it. He was trying his best to close the distance between them and catch up with his eternal rival. Suddenly, he was pulled out of his memories by a hissing sound coming from the radio. Looking up at her, Thomas assumed that it was Ksenia calling as usual with another request. Yawning widely, he accepted the challenge and asked what else was going on with her. However, instead of the familiar girl's voice, a man's voice was heard on the other side, who, skipping the part with greetings, asked what Thomas was doing. The hero immediately recognized who the voice belonged to and frowned, fully aware of how unpleasant this conversation would be. Leon was more of a statement than a question to Thomas about whether the capsule left on Route 13 was his doing. The hero remembered the old days, noting that after so many years, Leon had not managed to get rid of this annoying manner of communication. He sighed tiredly and asked Leon why he thought that. He explained that if the capsule suddenly appeared in a place that had not yet been destroyed, it meant that someone had left it there. The hero remained silent, realizing that this time he really couldn't get out of it. Meanwhile, Leon continued, asking him why he did it and whether he thought about what could have happened if the capsule had opened and monsters had appeared from it. Surprise flashed across the hero's face, and he asked in confusion if a monster could hatch from an egg. He replied that no one hatches from it and that this capsule is a time portal. The hero pursed his lips in displeasure, realizing that he had retired too long ago and was now far behind the latest information regarding the situation with the monsters. Without changing his tone, Leon said that he would not beat around the bush and would get straight to the point. When he said that Thomas should go to Jeju with everyone, his gaze immediately darkened. Leon grimaced in displeasure when the hero asked what would happen if he refused this, and replied that there was an open instructor position there and he would recommend Thomas there. The hero replied that he was living quite well here. When Leon asked if he really believed that there was a future in such a place, the hero did not answer. He knew the answer to this question, but diligently ignored it. The tense silence that followed was broken by Leon's voice, asking how much longer Thomas was going to nurse his inferiority complex. Getting up from his seat, the man looked out the window again and said that at that time they could not do anything. Neither of them had the necessary talent then. The man himself reproached himself for many mistakes made in the past, which were made due to a lack of talent. So he understood Thomas's feelings perfectly. When the hero sharply responded that he was not going to go anywhere and that they should find another instructor, Ksenia's gaze became significantly sadder. Turning around, she headed towards the exit of the office. With a loud sigh, Leon warned Thomas that the entire city would soon be in danger and asked him to try not to die there. Immediately after these words, the connection was broken. For several minutes, the hero stared motionless at the radio, completely immersed in his far from rosy thoughts. A few days later, he came out into a germinating field. 1 year and 11 months have passed since the war began, during which time he has planted seeds in an abandoned field where enough rice is now growing. After the hero had collected enough, he tightened the bag. He then threw it onto his back. Thomas remembered what old man Kim had said, that with just rice and a hoe, they could survive even in the hardest of times. That's why he decided to follow this advice. Only thanks to this, in addition to canned food, he could eat fresh rice. But as usual, he spent most of his time on the forum. Due to Hunter's latest post, rumors have emerged that he is actually a girl. But Thomas strongly doubted the veracity of these rumors. One of the reasons for this was that although it was quite easy for a girl to kill a person with a pistol, moving and cutting up the body was quite difficult unless she was acting alone. The hero pushed these thoughts away, thinking that this was complete nonsense. Suddenly, Leon's request for him to try not to die sounded in his head. Thomas quickly erased the image from his mind, telling himself that his bunker was the safest place in the area, and therefore he would never die. No, his memories kept returning to the past, to the time of their training. At that time, he was greatly irritated by the boy sitting in front of him, who asked clear and direct questions to the instructors, which made him stand out from the crowd. Thomas remembered well the looks that he cast in his direction for reasons that were still unclear to him. Leon was obsessed with the idea of competing with him and tried to get around him wherever possible. Suddenly, the hissing of a radio brought him out of his thoughts. Thomas was sure that this time it was Leon again. After answering the call, he wearily said that if they wanted to force the idea of the island on him again, it was useless. When the hero was about to break the connection, suddenly Ksenia's loud voice was heard on the other side, who said that Leon Neal had died. This news greatly surprised Thomas. Straightening up, he asked in bewilderment what had happened. The girl only replied that Leon made this decision himself. Before the hero's eyes again appeared the image of his eternal rival and his usual look with which he looked at him. Meanwhile, Ksenia continued, telling that Leon left behind a will, which stated that someone had to take responsibility for what was happening, after which she asked if Thomas would come to the funeral. Thomas was simply stunned by this news and did not hear the question addressed to him. The girl repeated this question several more times until she finally heard the hero's reaction, after which she said that they had set up an altar in the military hospital where her husband was now lying. She also reminded him that in order to get to Seoul, Thomas would have to drive along the road with the capsule, and he became wary and asked if there were any problems with that. Ksenia explained that a security detachment had been sent there yesterday and that there were several awakened people among them. What he heard was yet another shocking piece of news for Thomas that evening. Ksenia decided to warn him in advance so that it would not be a surprise for the hero when he encountered them. Clearly sensing a familiar presence behind him, Thomas asked with a hint of irony in his voice if, of all places, they had decided to send the awakened here. Afterwards, he turned around slightly and asked the phantom standing behind him with displeasure whether he was really going to continue fighting with him for honor until the very end and force him to follow the unknown hero's path again and again. But Leon, standing next to him, did not answer. He just smiled weakly and shrugged. This irritated Thomas, and with a sharp movement, he turned completely towards the figure behind him, irritably saying that this was completely his style. But there was no one behind him anymore. Rising from his seat, the hero walked over to the weapons cabinet and opened it, taking out 2 battle axes. These were some of the few things he took with him after retirement. After this, he got on his bicycle and left the bunker. Although he tried hard to deny it, he really wanted to visit Leon one last time as a former soldier and as a friend. To avoid the road where the troops were stationed, Thomas took a detour along a nearby trail. But suddenly a soldier appeared in the darkness, riding towards him, and immediately ordered him to stop. When Sam saw Thomas's familiar face, he was very surprised. The hero recognized him only by his puzzled voice, because his eyes were too blinded by the light from the headlights. He remembered that not long ago they had been on a mission together to clean up mutant cats. When Sam asked where the hero was going, he replied that he needed to go to Seoul. The hunter immediately pointed somewhere behind him and asked Thomas to follow him. The hero asked, confused, if he could just let him through, taking out a cigarette, and he lit it, replying that he wouldn't mind doing that. But there was one caveat. Having said this, he nodded to the side. There was a group of the rest of his team there. Sam explained that it was not he who was at the helm here, but these blue-eyed ones. The hero knew very well what the tiger sign on the cloaks of this group meant. Roaring Tiger. This symbol was worn by those who belonged to a new breed of hunters that appeared about 6 years ago. Thomas frowned in displeasure. He didn't want to mess with these guys at all. When about a third of humanity was killed due to the appearance of monsters, a strange phenomenon was noticed. People who exhibited abilities similar to those of monsters were called awakened. After much careful research, scientists found a way to artificially induce the appearance of these forces, and the government began actively hiring such people as hunters. As a result, the old-school hunters were driven out of the battlefield. Noticing Thomas, Kevin called out to Sam and asked who he was. He replied that he was a former hunter. Sam laughed uncertainly when Kevin asked if by X he meant a fake hunter just like himself. Then he took a drag, looking sadly to the side. The young hunters' faces wore mocking grins, and Kevin asked suspiciously why the former hunter was riding along some dark path instead of a normal road, like a criminal. His words made Sam glance warily towards Thomas, watching his reaction. Ignoring this attack in his direction, the hero asked Kevin what class he was from. The expression on the guy's face immediately changed to bewilderment. Approaching Thomas, Kevin drawled that the former hunter was not so hopeless. A few moments later, he stopped in front of him, leaning closer and arrogantly asking what class Thomas was from. He glanced sideways at the guy and replied that he was from the 13th. Putting his hand on his shoulder, Kevin replied that they didn't consider grades up to 18 as seniors, so since Thomas was studying to be a hunter, he should know how dangerous the capsules were and that the best decision for him would be to turn around and go home the easy way. The hero clenched his fists, hidden in his pockets, holding back the irritation that was rolling in, reminding himself that he should avoid conflicts. At the moment when the thought flashed through his head that perhaps it would really be better to go back, Leon's dissatisfied voice was heard behind him, asking whether he was coming or not, how much longer he had to wait. This voice helped him make the right decision. Taking his hand out of his pocket, Thomas pointed somewhere ahead, under the puzzled looks of the hunters. He pointed directly at the capsule in front of him. Then he asked if he could continue on his way if he dealt with this capsule. Confident that Thomas would not be able to do anything, the hunters let him pass, deciding that at least they would be able to amuse themselves. Kevin even ordered the youngest of them that if the hero somehow miraculously copes with this task, then she will personally take him to where he needed to go. Thomas ignored the undisguised whispers and laughter behind his back, completely focused on his goal. He remembered that according to the old military doctrine, there weren't many ways to defeat a monster alone, so now he would use the most suitable one, namely close-range combat. He approached the capsule in a matter of moments, raising his axe to strike as he went. As his axe approached the capsule, the barrier was activated again, and an axe approached Thomas's neck as well. But the hero was ready for this and quickly reacted, repelling this attack. As he was about to attack again, several black spike-like bubbles appeared in the air in front of him. Taking a step to the side, the hero dodged them too. Kevin watched what was happening there with bewilderment. Sam's face also showed strong surprise. Thomas tried to strike the capsule again and again, but was immediately defended from the shield's counterattack. Cold beads of sweat rolled down the boy's face as he realized what Thomas had planned. Suddenly, the capsule turned into a blue portal, which grew larger with each passing moment. The shock on the hunters' faces turned to wild horror. Shouting about Thomas's madness, they ran as far away from there as possible. Sam, shocked by what was happening, remained standing in place. Despite the danger that lay before him and the strong gusts of wind that knocked him off his feet, the hero also remained standing in his place. A few moments later, a monster began to appear from the portal. At first, Thomas decided that the person in front of him was a dancer, based on his build. But as soon as the monster appeared completely, the hero realized that this was a monster of a higher level, a necromancer. In one leap, he was at the level of his head with 2 axes raised to strike. All of the monster's limbs were cut off in one movement, and he didn't even have time to do anything. The hero knew that the necromancer was unable to use his force field at such a close range, which he took advantage of. But from his damaged parts of his body, deadly spikes will fly out and try to attack. The hero decided to take a risk and get closer to the monster. As soon as he succeeded, he immediately cut off his head with one blow. The young hunters couldn't believe that Thomas had actually defeated the necromancer single-handedly, and while holding back their cries of delight, Lexi filmed the entire fight on camera. Turning his attention from the remains of the monster's body to them, the hero asked in bewilderment why they were all standing idle instead of removing the barricades they had put up. But the young hunters, shocked by what had happened, did not even move from their place. None of them could believe that Thomas had actually dealt with such a powerful monster on his own. Without taking his eyes off him, Kevin said that Lexi should make sure that Thomas would get to the place he needed safe and sound. The girl immediately began to refuse, asking with bewilderment why her. Sam, who had come to his senses, approached them and, grinning contentedly, said that he would take Thomas himself, since he was also one of the old ones, and that they could examine the body in the meantime. The hero didn't care who was driving him, so he didn't interfere in this squabble. A few minutes later, they drove off the highway. Sitting in the back seat, the hero said that Sam didn't need to drive him personally. He smiled and replied that he wanted it that way. after which he added that he was glad that these guys were finally shut up, because he was already starting to get pretty annoyed by the fact that these third rankers with no combat experience continued to call him an old man. Thomas looked at him thoughtfully. He knew that the abilities of awakened ones were judged in ranks, and the difference in abilities between ranks was simply staggering. Ranks 1 through 4 had supernatural abilities such as perception and foresight. Physical abilities did not change. Ranks 5 through 9 had abilities like force fields and telekinesis, which involved direct physical force, and usually the abilities of these ranks could be used in combat. The rarest and most powerful were the awakened ones with the 10th ram and above. Their power was beyond humanity. When Sam said that he felt a great sense of relief when Thomas put those guys in their place, the hero asked why he hadn't done it himself yet. After a short silence, he replied that his chances of winning would be about 65% in his favor. But he did not dare take the risk because he now had special circumstances. If something happened to him, it would become much more difficult for his family to survive in this world. Thomas listened to him in silence, thinking that it was because of such fears that he had not started a family. Meanwhile, Sam continued, saying that no matter how hard things get for him, he must endure and survive at any cost in order to take care of his loved ones. This is how our heroes got to Seoul. Soon the car stopped at the old hospital building. As Thomas got out of the car, Sam called out to him and warned him that with the death of director Leon Neal, the old hunter's position had deteriorated greatly, so he needed to be careful. The hero replied that it didn't concern him in any way, so there was no need to worry. To this Sam objected, asking that even so he had friends on the national committee. Noticing Thomas's pursed lips, he smiled and said that when people started to shift responsibility onto others in order to save themselves, you could never predict what to expect from them, especially in a world where nobility was not held in high esteem. The hero grimaced with displeasure. He could not object to him in any way because he himself understood this simple truth. After saying a dry goodbye to Sam, he entered the empty building. It turned out that it wasn't difficult to find the right room because it was the only place with the lights on. Entering inside, the hero immediately saw a photo of Leon, framed with black satin ribbons and white flowers. He stopped in front of me and said that he had finally arrived. With a sad smile, Thomas asked why his funeral was being held in such a place. He himself almost died while getting here, but he was not destined to find out the answer, so he stood in silence in front of the photo, thinking about their past. Sometime later, Ksenia joined him, who said that there was no way back and the plan to move to the island was almost complete. Looking at Thomas, the girl asked if he knew why this plan was so important. The hero did not need any explanations because he understood everything perfectly well himself. The intensity of the faults is proportional to the population size, and there are far fewer faults on Jeju Island, and it is also geographically easier to defend, so it was fairly obvious that the government planned to concentrate all of Korea's resources there to secure the nation's future. Thomas also saw the obvious downside to this plan. All those who were not chosen would be abandoned to their fate. The hero asked in confusion why all the responsibility fell on Leon, since it was obvious that he could not have handled all this alone. Ksenia explained that from the very beginning, they planned to abandon millions of people in Seoul alone, and in order to calm people down, someone had to become a scapegoat. She said with sadness that this role went to the youngest of the people involved in this plan. Leon himself guessed about such an outcome, but he was too stubborn and went all the way. Suddenly, she looked at Thomas and asked if he knew that when Leon came to her wedding, he only gave 30,000 won. The hero asked with confusion if that was the minimum amount at that time. The girl laughed and replied that no, back then the minimum was already 50,000. The hero also chuckled, saying that this was very much in Leon's spirit. The girl's next words made Thomas wary. She told that shortly before Leon's death, on the day the main plan was completed, something came to him. It was right before their last conversation with Thomas. Leon, standing by the window, lifted the curtain, listening to his guest without turning around. He said that sooner or later someone would have to do it, and that someone would clearly not be from the top and certainly not from the bottom. And someone detached from the present, but looking firmly to the future, weighing the lives of millions of people and the future of all humanity to ensure balance. The guest hinted at his candidacy in an opaque text, and Leon had no choice but to refuse. The man sitting on the sofa said that in this way Leon would do what even the legendary hunter in the past had failed to do. At these words, Ksenia turned her sharp gaze from her boss to the guest. Leon also turned to him for the first time during the entire conversation and asked in bewilderment if they really believed that there was a future on that island. The man just smiled broadly and replied that no one knew for sure yet. A bright blue glow emanated from his slightly open eyes. When Thomas heard the man's name and learned that he was also involved in this plan, his face showed a mixture of shock, confusion, and horror. Watching his reaction, Ksenia was no longer sure whether she should tell him this information. She hesitated a little, then continued, saying that before Michael left, he had said something else. The old hunters would not be needed on the island. Afterwards, the girl lowered her head and hesitantly asked if there was one free room in Thomas's bunker. Having come to his senses, the hero looked at her with an unspoken question in his eyes. Suddenly, memories of the past came flooding back to him. When Thomas walked into his team's room, they immediately took notice of him. Rising from their beds, the soldiers saluted him, greeting their captain. Thomas ran his eyes over each of them. Many of his soldiers had serious fractures and wounds. Some were lucky enough to escape with lighter injuries, including Ksenia, after which he said in a stern tone that all the wounded should leave his team. The hero explained his order by saying that on the battlefield, an incompetent ally is more dangerous than a serious enemy. He saw how countless soldiers died senselessly because they were unable to fight because of weaklings like them. The hero understood how cruel those words could be, looking at the looks. Keeping an even tone, Thomas said that he did not want to witness such scenes anymore, so he ordered everyone to think about what he said and decide that it would be best if they left voluntarily. Immediately after that, he turned around and walked out into the corridor, leaving the confused soldiers alone. The tense silence was first broken by Yulia, who, wiping away burning tears, said that she could not go on like this any longer. Her partner standing next to her sympathetically patted her back, saying nothing because he shared her feelings. Suddenly, the girl took her palms away from her face and, turning to Ksenia, suggested that they leave together, arguing that if they continued to be under Thomas's command, they would simply go crazy. Frowning, Ksenia resolutely said that she was staying, although it was painful for her to admit it. But she understood that she was really lagging behind because of her injuries, so clenching her fists tighter, she would endure this and move on with renewed strength, so that one day she could return these words back to the commander. Our hero stood outside the doors of the chamber all this time, waiting for the decision his comrades would make. Listening to the girl's words made him believe that one day this would definitely happen, because she had the same willpower as he did. With these thoughts, he left the hospital walls. Now the girl stood before him, her head bowed low, and hesitantly, almost with a pleading voice, asked Thomas to shelter her son in his bunker. Thomas noted with a degree of regret that Ksenia had long since ceased to be the same as before. That self-confident and stubborn girl was no longer there. Coming out into the hall, the hero sat down in one of the guest chairs and, resting his head on his palms, thought about her request. He didn't know what he should do in this situation. Ksenia promised that she would send some money along with her son if Thomas allowed him to live with him. Having said that Seoul will soon be filled with raiders, she can't just leave her own child in such a place. Ksenia's words about how if something happened to her son, she wouldn't be able to survive it, were constantly running through his head. After weighing the pros and cons, Thomas sighed heavily, deciding that he had to refuse. He assumed that in a situation like this, it wouldn't end with ordinary raiders. If the armed forces intervene here and a civil war begins, then this will all drag on for a very long time. Suddenly, the door to the hospital opened and another person walked inside. He walked past Thomas, who was sitting in a chair, after which he stopped at the reception desk and said that he was a subordinate of Director Leon from the 18th grade, which attracted the attention of our hero. Thomas listened attentively to their conversation, turning halfway around. When Tyler said that his younger sister was very ill right now and asked if they had any extra medicine, the girl replied that at a time like this, medicine was in short supply, after which she asked if he was an authorized person, since this place was only for members of the National Committee. At this point, Thomas intervened, introducing himself and saying that he was a classmate of Leon Neal and Senior Commissioner Zinnia Reed. Glancing sideways at the stranger, he asked the girl to give the guy standing next to him the necessary medications. All this time, he looked at the hero with surprise. Once he was given the medicine, he bowed to Thomas, thanking him for his help. He asked if Tyler was really Leon's friend, because if he was in the 18th grade, he shouldn't be that close to anyone from the upper or lower grades. The guy awkwardly scratched the back of his head and replied that of all the higher-ups, the director's name was the easiest to remember, so he thought that if he mentioned him, he would definitely be given medicine. The hero mentioned the 18th grade because after that, the main force of hunters consisted only of awakened ones, and those who did not have abilities no longer had a future as hunters and were very rarely sent to the front against monsters, giving all the dirty work. Thus, the 18th class was stuck in the middle between the awakened ones with superpowers and the seniors, simple fighters with a lot of combat experience not belonging to either one, so it was nicknamed the Cursed Stream. Meanwhile, Tyler continued, opening the package. He said that now it is simply impossible to find normal medications other than painkillers and antipyretics. Therefore, he had no other choice but to come here, to the Central Hospital of the National Committee. The hero frowned when Tyler started talking about his little sister again, once again convinced that he should refuse Ksenia's request. They left the hospital when it was already getting light outside. Tyler bowed to Thomas again, thanking him for his help. After which, humming a joyful song under his breath, he headed back. Stopping at his car, he opened the back door and, handing it to the girl sitting there, said that it hadn't worked, but he had managed to get some medicine, and that to get information about the members of the National Committee, they would have to dig deeper. The girl didn't answer him, she just pursed her lips slightly. In the same joyful tone, Tyler said that this was not all, because he had just recently managed to meet with that same skeleton from the forum. At that very moment, he felt a gun barrel pressed to the back of his head. Thomas said with displeasure that since Tyler knew a lot, this conversation between them would be short. Then he ordered him to raise his hands up. Our hero had no doubts about who Defender was, so he acted decisively. He did as Thomas asked and slowly raised his hands. Then he lowered one leg from the car. The next moment, he turned around and grabbed one of Thomas's hands, knocking the gun out of his hand. Only his gaze betrayed his surprise at what had happened. Quickly grabbing the knocked-out weapon, Tyler said that if he wanted to talk so much, then first he should put away such dangerous things. Thomas wasn't going to play by someone else's terms, so he lunged forward, knocking his own weapon out of the guy's palm. Tyler watched his lightning-fast actions in amazement. Having made a feint, the hero rushed for the pistol. He managed to catch it just before it reached the ground. Immediately after that, he pointed it at his opponent. He didn't want to give up either, so his foot was already rushing towards Thomas. He didn't have time to dodge before the pistol was knocked out of his hands again with one sharp blow. The hero realized that weapons were useless here and decided to resort to hand-to-hand combat. Tyler, coming down from the jump, watched the actions of his opponent, trying to predict what he would do next. Thomas emerged from behind him and rushed at him with a fierce intent to kill. Tyler, not expecting this, was unable to dodge a direct blow to the head. But this didn't stop him. Smiling, he managed to grab Thomas's bike, after which he dealt him his blow. But he dodged. Thus, they exchanged a series of blows, trying to hit their opponent. At one of these moments, Thomas took his time and made another attack. Taking another blow to the face, Tyler fell to the ground, wiping the blood with his sleeve. He said that the hero lived up to all his expectations. He is really strong. When the guy looked up at Thomas, surprise was reflected there. During this time, the hero managed to get his gun back and was now looking dangerously at Tyler. He slowly rose from the ground, put one of his hands behind his back, and carefully began to take out his weapon, saying along the way that if Thomas wanted it so much, then so be it. They would have a real duel. A confident grin appeared on his face. However, our hero's next action made him wary, and excitement flashed in his eyes. Thomas's target was not him at all this time. He aimed at Tyler's sister, who was right behind him. The guy stepped to the side, covering the girl. There was no trace of the previous smile left on his face. He understood that if he got involved in the fight now, Thomas could accidentally shoot her. So he threw down his weapon and raised his hands up, saying that he was just joking and that a hero shouldn't react so strongly to everything. But Thomas didn't fall for it and didn't lower his weapon. A friendly smile appeared on the guy's face, and he suggested settling everything with a normal conversation. Hearing this, the hero was even a little disappointed that Tyler acted in such an expected way. He stood with his hands raised the whole time, covering his sister with himself. He suddenly asked when exactly Thomas had begun to suspect him. The hero thought for a moment. He then replied that he had been sure of this from the very beginning. His answer surprised Tyler quite a bit, which was evident on his face. The hero explained that when you reach the level of team captain, you begin to notice a lot of things. Also, since Tyler was in the 18th grade, he also knew what kind of work he did abroad. All the main work and the battle with monsters was taken on by the awakened ones, not forgetting to mock their older colleagues. Meanwhile, the fighters from the 18th class did the dirtiest work, getting rid of the unnecessary ones by cutting their necks. And Tyler was one of them. He did his job without a drop of emotion, coldly and quickly. Among all of them, he was the best at his job, so he became the unofficial leader. It was Tyler who pushed the others to carve their call signs on the heads of the dead to mark their achievements. His own call sign was previously Predator, and it was this word that was carved into countless of his victims. Now this word has been replaced by Defender. Thomas had heard a lot about the famous squad of assassins at one time, which he told Tyler about. He chuckled and said that he didn't expect the rumors to spread so far. But everything the hero said did not convince him that he knew about everything from the very beginning. Without lowering his gun, Thomas replied that there was other evidence besides this, after which he said that he once visited one of the places where Tyler had managed to be. There, he took the chance and studied the body left there. Thanks to this, he was able to find out a lot about the killer. For example, his build, his gait, and his dominant hand, even those traits and habits that Tyler himself might not have even suspected. Comparing all the facts he had, it was easy enough to guess that Tyler was Defender. All this time, he listened to the evidence listed by the hero without interrupting. But as soon as Thomas said the last sentence, he could not hold back any longer and laughed. The hero asked in bewilderment what was amusing him so much. After laughing, he admitted that all this time he had only considered his class strange, but it turns out that all hunters are like that. Afterwards, he smiled and said that Thomas's deduction had let him down a little this time. The hero asked in surprise what this meant. Tyler replied that he does leave traces behind out of old habit and lets everyone know he's there, but he's not exactly a defender. At that moment, the girl who had been sitting in the car all this time approached him, and he turned his gaze to her. Tyler introduced his sister to Thomas, after which he said that defender is a duet. The hero frowned slightly and, remembering the post suggesting that the killer could have been a girl, thought that they were right to some extent. Meanwhile, Tyler explained that he usually does all the heavy lifting and Sophia writes the posts or deals with everything from a distance, even though she may be a monster online, but in reality she is as helpless as a hamster. Still holding them at gunpoint, Thomas asked the boy with suspicion in his voice why he was telling him all this. The hero understood that the fact that there were two of them must be a strategically important secret, and he was very alarmed by the fact that for some reason this secret was revealed to him. Sophia rose on her toes and, covering her mouth with her hand, whispered something to her brother without taking her eyes off Thomas. Both brother and sister simultaneously broke into smiles, and Tyler replied that he did it for fun without any specific reason. Thomas pursed his lips in displeasure, coming to the conclusion that this couple was not serious at all. Looking at his frowning face, Tyler replied that they weren't really bad people, so he could calm down and relax. Without answering, the hero turned his gaze to their legs, assessing their stance. The brother and sister relaxed and waited for his reaction. Tyler chuckled slightly and asked if Thomas really wanted to start the second round. He replied that it would just be a waste of time. Afterwards, he put away his weapon and turned around, heading away. Suddenly, he was called and turned around. Tyler thanked him for the medicine with a smile on his face and said that they would see each other again soon. The hero's face instantly reflected bewilderment, and he asked with displeasure why they should meet again. On this note, they parted ways, got into the car, and the brother and sister drove back. Thomas had no idea that their new meeting would happen much sooner than he could have imagined. A couple of days after their meeting, he received a message from the hunter. Sophia asked if he had any extra bullets. If so, they were ready to exchange them for supplies. The hero immediately replied that he had no bullets, wanting to end this conversation as quickly as possible. But Sophia knew that he was lying, and she told him about it, threatening him with death. Thomas frowned, noting to himself that on the internet, she was completely different from herself in reality. The girl made a couple more attempts to persuade him, but the hero was categorical and always gave only one answer. Then she had to take extreme measures. In exchange for cartridges, she promised to increase activity at his posts. This offer was too tempting for Thomas, and he could not refuse. When the hero arrived at the meeting place, it was already dark outside. He checked the hastily drawn map again. Afterwards, I looked around. They had agreed to meet at an abandoned mansion that was located near a theme park, so any doubts that he had come to the wrong place disappeared once he saw the rides. Thomas approached the large mansion, noting that the height of the building made it fairly easy to defend, but the terrain was too exposed. A little further away, he noticed high fences with barbed wire, which served as a kind of protection. Suddenly, something else caught his attention. There was someone's withered corpse hanging from one of the trees growing near the house. Just at that moment, the door creaked, causing Thomas to turn around. Tyler came outside and waved at him, saying that he was glad to see him so soon. Thomas went up to him, not forgetting to ask about the corpse in the tree. Not wanting to go into details, he simply replied that it was not the most pleasant story. The hero couldn't help but notice that while the guy was speaking, his profile was suspiciously reminiscent of that corpse. Changing the subject, he said he had brought the bullets and asked why they needed so many. He tightened his grip on the suitcase handle, wondering warily if Tyler usually used knives, so was this really for his sister? Instead of answering, the boy pressed his finger to his lips, gesturing for him not to say anything. Then he advised Thomas to listen more carefully and pointed towards the park. The hero immediately strained his ears. A few moments later, he managed to hear someone's distant, quiet crying. Through the heart-rending crying coming from the park, one could hear pleas for help. Looking at Tyler, he asked if it was a child, and Tyler nodded, confirming his guess. After which he said that there was a pile of garbage in that park that needed to be dealt with. Frowning, the hero asked in bewilderment whether the marauders had really stooped so low as to take a child hostage. As Tyler approached the fence, he replied that this was indeed the case. Afterwards, he explained that when someone hears a child crying, they immediately go to help. They kill men immediately, and women are raped. Then they force the children to continue begging for help. Thomas considered such actions too inhumane. Noticing his reaction, Tyler smiled. He said that's exactly why they needed the bullets, because he was going to kill the whole gang. A couple of minutes later, they entered the house. Tyler immediately led his guest to the upper floor. As he walked up the stairs, the hero kept a suspicious gaze on the guy walking ahead. He didn't trust him at all and expected that he could do something at any moment. The expression on Tyler's face earlier when he talked about killing was far too joyful. This also made him wary. Suddenly, Tyler stopped and turned slightly towards the hero walking behind him, after which he asked if his sister had talked about anything else besides bullets. Thomas had absolutely no idea what was being discussed, but he really didn't like the guy's look. Tyler looked at the hero expectantly, waiting for his reaction. Meanwhile, he carefully moved his right hand behind his back and grasped the handle of the axe, hidden under a layer of clothing, with his palm. He knew that the guy standing in front of him was an unpredictable opponent, and even he could not guess what he was about to do. Without waiting for an answer from him, Tyler explained by asking if the hero had brought something to eat with him. Thomas was prepared for anything, but definitely not for this kind of question, so he froze in surprise for a few moments. As soon as they went up to the room where the brother and sister had settled, he pulled out a pack of cookies he had saved and gave them to them. Although initially the hero took these cookies with him in order to replenish the calories burned on the road if necessary. While munching on a cookie, Tyler complimented him on his excellent cooking skills. After reaching for another portion, Thomas watched them with disapproval the whole time. The fact that these two did not care about safety at all. He had long ago realized if he were in their place, he would not take cookies that could be poisoned. As he thought about this, he turned his gaze to the tea he had been offered. Based on such considerations, the hero decided that he should not touch the tea. Noticing his wary gaze directed at the cup, Sophia typed something on her laptop and then showed it to Thomas. There he read messages from her that he was not poisoned and it was just very tasty tea. Frowning, Thomas asked why she couldn't just say so. Tyler looked at his sister and explained that his sister preferred to write instead of talk, and the hero, despite his fears, decided to try the tea. To his surprise, it turned out to be really delicious, just as Sophia said. Trying to hide his reaction, he asked Tyler how he was going to deal with the looters, because if they had hostages, there must be quite a lot of them. The brother and sister immediately turned their gaze to him. Afterwards, Tyler replied that they would first take care of the little ones, and when their pleas died down, the marauders would immediately come to find out what was going on. While loading the pistol, he continued to explain that in this way he was going to gradually reduce the large number of marauders and finally finish off the rest. Part of the children's distraction was Sophia's responsibility. Using drones, she would drop bricks from above, a method that was quite simple and left no traces. Here, Thomas interrupted the guy, asking if they were really going to get rid of the children. He turned his gaze to his sister and replied that if this was not done, then everything would only become more complicated, and besides, they were no one to him. Sharing his opinion, Sophia said that if they do not shelter these children, they will not survive long. In today's world, it is difficult for children to survive without parents. Time was not on their side. Thomas's gaze grew considerably heavier after her words. Taking another sip of tea, he thought that in a way they were right. He should also not forget that the defender is a duet, and this method was the best strategy for them when facing a large number of enemies. But Thomas couldn't help but be concerned about the way they were solving problems, so he decided to intervene and suggest another way that would provide a higher chance of success and reduce the level of risk. The brother and sister looked at each other thoughtfully. Having developed a plan, sometime later they began to implement it, getting as close to the park as possible. Sophia was supposed to make the first move by launching the drones. Her job was to lure the enemies away. As soon as the marauders noticed the approaching drone, all their attention immediately switched to it. Standing at the gate, Thomas and Tyler watched as their enemies moved further away, trying to catch up and shoot down the drone. The guys looked at each other, after which the hero nodded his head approvingly. Clutching an axe in his hand, he cautiously peered out from his hiding place, and having waited for the right moment, he made his move. The man standing with his back to him turned around, hearing a strange sound. As soon as he did this, he froze in horror as an axe flew at him at high speed. It hit the man straight, slicing open his head. At the same time, Thomas took aim at the second man. Approaching him from behind, the hero grabbed him by the hair and raised his axe to strike. Thus, our heroes dealt with the remaining guards in the rear. Having laid the man on the ground, Thomas began to look around. His attention was drawn to a small structure nearby. He rose to his feet and walked to the door. Opening it, he stopped at the threshold. One of the boys woke up from the bright light that penetrated inside and sat up in his bed, covering his eyes from the light. Looking at the frozen figure at the entrance, he asked uncertainly if it was really his turn to go now. Thomas nodded his head weakly. Now he had to choose one of the children that they would use as bait. When he returned back, Tyler was already waiting for him there. Leading the child along, the hero said that those who went after the drone should return soon, and that's where he would need help. Tyler chuckled and asked if Thomas was sure he was ready to trust him with this matter. The hero coldly replied that he trusted not him, but Defender's skills. As he expected, the marauders soon dealt with the drone. As soon as this happened, Sophia contacted the guys and warned them that they should be prepared. They immediately realized that they had no time for talking and needed to act quickly. A couple of minutes later, the men who had left returned to their previous positions. When they saw that one of their hostages was wandering around here on his own, they were very unhappy. One of the marauders stepped forward and called out to the boy, asking in bewilderment what he was doing there. Then he grabbed him by the collar, repeating his question. At that very moment, Thomas and Tyler silently appeared behind the backs of the two remaining marauders and also silently killed them. It was not difficult for them to deal with the last man, and after finishing with him, Tyler headed towards the frightened child. Stopping next to him, he placed his hand on his shoulder, drawing his attention to himself. Smiling, he suggested that he go on the roller coaster. Thomas stood to the side, thinking that if the marauders hadn't used children, this battle would have been quite simple. But even so, for two experienced killers, this did not make the task much more difficult. Thanks to the innocent bait, they managed to successfully get rid of the crowd of marauders. It all ended only at dawn. The entire park was strewn with corpses. Thomas couldn't help but leave his mark on the finish. After taking several photos of the dead bodies, he showed them to his sister, asking which one she wanted to upload to the forum. Thomas did not take part in this. He preferred to sit on the sidelines, remaining an outside observer. The child he had chosen as bait was still there. Meeting his gaze, the hero said that everything was over, and now he could go wherever he wanted. But even after his words, the child remained standing in the same place. Noticing this, Tyler, with a hint of mockery in his voice, reminded Thomas of how much he cared about these children. He even thought at that moment that the hero was going to take care of them himself. But now that everything was over, he behaves completely differently. The hero coldly replied that now everyone was for himself, and since Tyler had brought it up, he was much more humane than those who wanted to kill these children. Sophia was a little embarrassed by his words. Tyler tightened his grip on his weapon and asked if Thomas was implying that he wanted to continue their fight. Thomas gave the guy in front of him a dark look. He responded in kind, the tension between the two of them growing. Suddenly, a boy stepped forward, shouting that they should not start a fight, after which he bowed low and thanked them for saving him. Tyler sighed and put his weapon away. Thomas also turned away, lowering his head. Immediately after he said his words of gratitude, the child hurried to leave that place, and Thomas whispered, as if convincing himself that this was the best decision.